Name of the story: The Forgotten Room. The day the Chandler family moved into the old mansion, it was as if the house had been waiting for them. The towering structure stood at the edge of a small, quiet town, an imposing figure against the sprawling landscape. Though it had been empty for years, the mansion still held its grandeur, its dark windows reflecting the dull light of an overcast sky. The air around it seemed thick, like the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for the new owners to step inside. Ellen Chandler, the matriarch of the family, stood at the foot of the wide, crumbling staircase leading up to the front door. Her husband, Mark, and their two children, Emily and Ben, unloaded boxes from the car. They were excited, but there was something about the mansion that unsettled Ellen. She couldn't quite put her finger on it, but the house seemed wrong. Not in a typical old house way, but in a deeper, more ancient sense. Like it carried a secret, something it didn't want them to find. As Ellen stepped inside, the musty smell of neglected rooms greeted her. The grand entry hall was large, with faded wallpaper peeling from the walls and a dusty chandelier hanging from the ceiling. It felt like the house had been frozen in time, as though the people who had once lived here simply vanished one day, leaving everything behind. The wooden floors creaked beneath her feet, and she couldn't help but shudder. "Hey Mom, check this out." Ben's voice broke through her thoughts. She turned to see him standing at the foot of a narrow, winding staircase that led to the second floor. "What is it, Ben?" Ellen called out, walking toward him. Ben grinned, pointing at a small door on the far end of the hall. "This door, it's not on the floor plan." Ellen followed his gaze and squinted. It was a small, unassuming door tucked into the corner, almost hidden behind an old, dusty bookshelf. She hadn't noticed it when they first walked in, but now that Ben had pointed it out, she couldn't stop staring at it. The door was sealed shut, its edges dark with age, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. "That's strange," she murmured. "Maybe it's just a closet." Ben shrugged, uninterested. He was already distracted by something else. But Ellen couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong with that door. She glanced over her shoulder to see Mark struggling to carry a large box up the stairs, Emily trailing behind him. "Mom, we need help with this one," Mark called, his voice strained. Reluctantly, Ellen turned away from the door and headed toward the stairs. The day passed in a blur of unpacking and settling in, but her mind kept drifting back to that door. There was something about it, something that didn't feel right. After dinner, as the family gathered around the fireplace in the living room, Ellen couldn't help but ask, "Did anyone else notice the little door in the hall?" Mark looked up from the fire, eyebrow raised. "The one near the bookshelf?" He seemed to consider this for a moment. "Yeah, I saw it. But it's probably just an old storage closet or something." "That's what I thought," Ellen said, though she wasn't entirely convinced. "But why would they seal it off? The house doesn't look like it's been renovated in years, and that door, it's just so out of place." Mark gave her a reassuring smile. "You're just tired, Ellen. This place is huge. There's bound to be a few oddities." Ellen nodded but couldn't shake the unease gnawing at her. She glanced at Emily and Ben, both of whom were absorbed in their own activities, their faces lit by the flickering firelight. They seemed oblivious to the odd feeling that was creeping up her spine. Later that night, as the house settled into an eerie silence, Ellen found herself standing in front of the small door once again. The house had grown quiet, and she couldn't help but feel drawn to it. She ran her fingers over the old wood, the cool surface sending a shiver through her. It was as though the house itself was beckoning her. Without thinking, she reached for the doorknob. The door creaked as it gave way, the sound echoing through the empty hall. Inside was nothing but darkness. But there was something else, something Ellen couldn't place. A cold, musty air seemed to seep from the crack in the door, and she felt a chill crawl up her spine. She hesitated for a moment, but her curiosity was stronger than her fear. Slowly, she pushed the door open, revealing a small, narrow room. It was pitch black, save for the faint light spilling in from the hallway behind her. She reached for the light switch, but there was none. The room felt wrong. There was something about it, a sense of suffocating darkness that clung to the air. Ellen stepped inside, her footsteps muffled by the thick dust that covered the floor. As her eyes adjusted to the dim light, she noticed strange markings on the walls, symbols etched deep into the wood. The shapes were unfamiliar, archaic, almost like a language she couldn't understand. Her breath quickened. She backed away, her heart pounding in her chest. There was something off about this room, something far worse than a simple forgotten closet. Suddenly, she heard a voice behind her. "Ellen? What are you doing?" Mark's voice echoed down the hall. Ellen quickly turned, her hand still pressed against the doorframe. She was too shaken to respond immediately, but she forced herself to speak. I found something. A room. It's not on the floor plan." Mark appeared in the doorway, his brow furrowed in confusion. "A hidden room? Ellen, are you sure?" Before she could respond, Ben and Emily appeared behind him, their curious eyes wide with interest. "It's just a room, right?" Emily asked, peering over her father's shoulder. "Not just any room," Ellen whispered, still unable to tear her eyes away from the darkness inside. "There's something wrong with it." Mark sighed, a skeptical expression on his face. "I'll check it out, but I'm sure it's nothing." He pushed past her and stepped into the room. For a moment, nothing happened. Then he let out a low whistle. "Wow, this place is definitely old. Look at all this dust." But Ellen could see it in his eyes. He was unnerved. The air felt heavier now, thicker, as if the room had a presence of its own, something watching them. Suddenly, a loud bang echoed from the back of the room. Mark jumped, his hand flying to his chest in shock. "What the hell was that?" he asked, his voice shaking. Ben and Emily exchanged frightened glances, and Ellen felt her heart race. It was as if the house itself was coming alive, reacting to their intrusion. They had disturbed something, and whatever it wasn't happy. The bang echoed through the dark room, reverberating off the walls like a warning. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, her breath coming in shallow gasps. She turned to Mark, who stood frozen, his face pale under the dim light. The children huddled behind him, their eyes wide with fear. Mark took a hesitant step forward, his voice barely above a whisper. "What was that? Did you hear it?" Ellen nodded, unable to speak. The room felt colder now, a bone-deep chill that seemed to seep into her very soul. The air was thick with a presence that was almost tangible, pressing against her, suffocating her. She felt as though something was watching them, waiting for them to make the next move. "Maybe it's just the house settling," Mark said, though his voice was unsure. He glanced at the others, trying to convince himself more than anyone else. "That was no house settling," Ellen said, her voice trembling. She could barely hear herself over the pounding of her heart. "We need to get out of here." But before they could move, a sound like a low whisper filled the room, faint but unmistakable. It seemed to come from all directions at once, echoing through the walls, the floor, and the very air around them. "Ellen!" The voice was soft, almost melodic, but it sent a shiver through her that made her want to flee. She turned to Mark, her eyes wide with panic. "Did you hear that?" He looked at her, his face drawn with confusion and fear. "Who's there?" The whisper came again, louder this time, more insistent. "Get out!" The words were clear now, and Ellen's blood ran cold. It wasn't just a voice. It felt as though the house itself was speaking to them, warning them away. "We need to go," Mark said, his voice now urgent. He grabbed Ellen's arm, pulling her toward the door. "Now!" But as they turned to leave, something strange happened. The door slammed shut with a deafening bang, the force of it rattling the walls. Ellen stumbled back, her breath catching in her throat. They were trapped. Panic surged within her as she rushed to the door, yanking on the handle. It wouldn't budge. It was as though the house had closed in around them, trapping them in its dark, suffocating grip. "Mom! Dad!" Emily cried out, her voice trembling with fear. Ben grabbed his sister's hand, pulling her away from the door. "It's not opening. What's happening?" Ellen's mind raced, but nothing made sense. This wasn't supposed to be happening. It was just an old, abandoned mansion. But now it felt like they were at the mercy of something ancient and powerful, something that had been waiting for them. "Is there another way out?" Mark asked, his voice strained. Ellen scanned the room, her eyes flicking over the walls. The symbols etched into the wood seemed to shift in the dim light, twisting and warping as though they were alive. They looked almost familiar, like something she had seen before in a dream. But that wasn't possible. She hadn't dreamt of this place. "Over there," she said, pointing to a small door at the far side of the room, almost hidden behind a heavy curtain of dust. It was barely noticeable, as if it had been forgotten by time itself. Without waiting for a response, Mark dashed toward the door. But as he reached out to grab the handle, the room seemed to grow darker, the shadows deepening, swallowing the light. "Mark, no!" Ellen shouted, but it was too late. Mark's hand froze inches from the door. His body stiffened, and he let out a sharp gasp, his face contorting in pain. He stumbled backward, his breath coming in ragged gasps. "Ellen, something's wrong," he muttered, his voice barely a whisper. His hand reached out, as though he was trying to grasp something invisible in the air. But his fingers curled into a fist, his body trembling with fear. Ellen rushed to him, her heart racing. "What's happening?" "Mark, talk to me." But he couldn't answer. His eyes were wide with terror, his face pale and covered in cold sweat. He was shaking uncontrollably, his body racked with spasms, as though something unseen was forcing him to its will. The whispering came again, louder now, surrounding them. "Leave now." Ellen backed away, her eyes wide with horror. She turned to Ben and Emily, who were huddled in the corner, their faces ashen with fear. "We need to get out of here," she said, her voice desperate. "Now!" But as she reached for the door, it slammed shut once again, trapping them inside the room. The temperature plummeted, and the air grew thick with the scent of decay, as though the very walls themselves were alive, breathing in the darkness. Something was watching them. Ellen could feel it. A presence that was far older and far more dangerous than anything they had encountered before. She could hear it in the whispers, feel it in the suffocating air. It was watching them, waiting for them to make the wrong move. A sudden crash from behind made her jump. The children screamed, and Ellen turned to see a figure standing in the doorway. The figure of a woman, dressed in old-fashioned clothes. Her face was pale and gaunt, her eyes dark and hollow. She was motionless, staring at them with an expression of cold, unfeeling malice. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. The woman's lips parted, and she spoke, her voice low and rasping. "You should not have come here." The words were like a curse, a dark warning that sent a wave of dread crashing over Ellen. The figure began to move toward them, her steps slow and deliberate, as though she had all the time in the world. Who are you?" Mark managed to choke out, his voice barely above a whisper. The woman didn't answer. She simply continued to move toward them, her eyes locked on theirs. The air around her seemed to grow colder, the shadows deepening as if the darkness itself was coming alive. Ellen could feel the weight of the room pressing down on her. the suffocating presence of the house closing in. She knew they had to leave, but the door wouldn't open, and the woman's gaze seemed to hold them in place, like she was trapping them with her very stare. "Mom, what is she?" Emily whispered, her voice barely audible. Her small hands clung to Ellen's sleeve, her body trembling with fear. "I don't know," Ellen said, her voice shaky. "But we have to get out of here. We have to go now." But before she could make another move, the woman spoke again, her voice now a guttural rasp. "Leave this place, or you will be its next victims." The words echoed through the room, sinking deep into Ellen's soul, and suddenly, the ground beneath her feet began to shake. The walls groaned, as if the house itself was coming to life, angry and alive. Ellen's mind raced. What had they stumbled upon? What had they awakened? And why did the house seem so alive? The shaking of the house grew more violent, the walls creaking as if they were about to collapse in on themselves. Ellen stumbled backward, clutching Emily and Ben tightly to her. Mark, still trembling, took a step toward the woman in the doorway, but his body was tense, as though something was holding him back. He opened his mouth to speak, but the words caught in his throat. The woman's eyes never left them. Her pale face was twisted in a grotesque expression, her lips curling into a faint, malevolent smile. She took another step forward, and Ellen could hear the soft scraping sound of her shoes dragging against the floor. "Why are you here?" the woman hissed, her voice dripping with venom. "Do you not know what this house has seen? Do you not know what it has taken?" Ellen's heart pounded in her chest as she held Emily close, shielding her from the woman's terrifying gaze. Ben's small body was pressed against her side, and she could feel his body shaking with fear. Mark stepped back, his eyes wide with terror. "We didn't know," Mark said, his voice hoarse. "We just moved in. We didn't know anything about this place. We didn't mean to." "You cannot leave," the woman interrupted, her voice sharp and cold. "Not now that you've come this far." The house seemed to groan in response, as if it were alive, feeding off the fear that permeated the air. The temperature dropped even further, the icy chill seeping into Ellen's bones. It was as though the very essence of the mansion had wrapped itself around them, closing off every possible escape. "We have to get out of here," Ellen whispered, more to herself than anyone else. She turned toward the door, but it remained firmly shut. Panic gripped her chest as she frantically yanked on the handle, but it wouldn't budge. They were trapped. "Please," Mark begged, his voice desperate. "Let us go. We don't want any trouble." The woman's smile widened, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was something twisted, something evil. "You cannot leave. You're already part of this house. You've woken it up, and now it will not let you go." Ellen's thoughts raced as she looked around the room. The symbols on the walls were now glowing faintly, pulsing in time with the tremors that rocked the mansion. The room was no longer just a forgotten space. It was a prison, and they were the prisoners. "Who are you?" Ellen asked, her voice shaking. "What do you want from us?" The woman's lips twisted into a grimace, her teeth bared like an animal preparing to strike. "I am the keeper of this house. I was the one who bound it, and I was the one who sealed the door. But it has awoken, and now you are part of its curse." The words hit Ellen like a physical blow. The keeper of the house? What did that mean? What had this woman done to the house? And why was it so desperate to keep them inside? "You have to let us go," Mark said again, his voice trembling with fear. "We don't belong here. We just moved in. We didn't know. You never should have come," the woman hissed, her voice low and venomous. "This house has tasted your fear. It has marked you, and now it will never let you go." With a sudden, violent movement, she raised her hand, and the air around them seemed to ripple. The temperature dropped even lower, the air so cold it stung their skin. Ellen felt a pressure building around her chest, as if the very walls of the room were closing in, suffocating her. She gasped for air, struggling to breathe as the weight of the house seemed to bear down on her. She looked around desperately, trying to find an escape, but all she could see were the shifting shadows, the dark symbols glowing ominously on the walls. The house wasn't just trapping them, it was feeding on them. "We're not going to make it," Emily whispered, her voice barely audible through the overwhelming silence. "What's happening to us?" Ellen didn't have an answer. She didn't know. But one thing was certain, the house wasn't just alive. It was hungry, and it wouldn't let them leave until it had taken everything. Mark reached for Ellen, his hand trembling as he clutched hers. "Ellen, we need to get out. We need to find a way. Please." But before she could respond, the floor beneath them cracked open with a loud, jarring noise. Ellen screamed as the ground trembled violently, sending them all tumbling to the floor. The walls seemed to buckle, and the house groaned in agony, as though it were alive, fighting to keep them trapped. Through the chaos, Ellen caught sight of the woman, who was no longer standing. Instead, she seemed to be merging with the shadows, her body dissolving into the darkened room. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light as she whispered one final, chilling command. "Leave if you can, but you'll never escape." The shadows in the room shifted, swirling around them, blocking out the light. The air was thick with a presence, something ancient and powerful, that wrapped around them like a suffocating blanket. They were caught, unable to escape the grip of the house. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. They were being pulled deeper into the darkness, the room shrinking around them. It was as though the walls were closing in, pushing them toward the heart of the house, toward whatever evil resided within. "Ellen!" Mark shouted, grabbing her arm as they were sucked into the dark void of the room. "We have to get out of here." But Ellen could barely hear him over the deafening noise of the house groaning and shifting. The house itself seemed to be alive, its very bones creaking under the weight of its dark history. Every step they took felt like a step toward doom. And then, as suddenly as it had started, the shaking stopped. The room fell into an eerie silence. The oppressive darkness lifted, leaving them in a cold, still air. They were back in the hallway. Ellen blinked, her mind spinning. What had just happened? Was it all just a nightmare? Had they somehow escaped? But then she looked around, and she realized that nothing had changed. They were still in the mansion, still trapped within its walls. The symbols on the walls still glowed faintly, the air still thick with an unshakable presence. And worst of all, they weren't alone. From the shadows, the woman emerged once more, her eyes locked onto them, her lips twisted into a cruel smile. She stepped forward, her voice soft and chilling. "You cannot escape," she whispered. "You belong to this house now." The woman's figure was barely visible in the dim hallway, her form emerging slowly from the shadows like a phantom, her eyes glinting with malice. Ellen's heart raced in her chest as the full weight of the situation crashed down on her. They were stuck. There was no escape. "Leave us alone," Mark shouted, his voice cracking with desperation. He stepped forward, his body tense, his fists clenched at his sides. "We've done nothing to you. Please, just let us go." The woman tilted her head slightly, her lips curling into that same twisted smile. She said nothing at first, just stared at him, her dark eyes filled with an unreadable expression. "You never had a choice," she replied finally, her voice quiet, almost conversational. "You were always meant to be here, always meant to face what this house has to offer. You've awakened something, something that cannot be put back to sleep." Ellen clutched Emily and Ben tighter, her eyes darting around the hallway, searching for some way out, some hidden passage, some escape from the nightmare that had trapped them in this godforsaken house. But there was nothing. No doors, no windows, no sign of life. only the oppressive silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. "We can't stay here," Ellen said through clenched teeth, her voice laced with panic. "We have to keep moving. We need to find a way out. We have to." But Mark stopped her with a firm hand on her shoulder. "It's no use," he said, his voice quiet but resolute. "The house won't let us go. We have to face it, whatever it is. It's the only way we're going to survive." Ellen swallowed hard, her throat dry as she looked up at him, her eyes filled with uncertainty. "What are you saying?" Mark's eyes were dark with fear, but there was something else in them, something hardened, something that told Ellen he had made a decision. "We can't keep running from this. We have to confront it." Before Ellen could respond, the woman's voice interrupted their conversation, chilling and distant, as though it had come from the walls themselves. "Confront it," she repeated, her voice dripping with mockery. "You think you can face what lies within these walls? You think you can defeat what's been here for centuries?" The house seemed to groan around them, its walls creaking and shifting as if it were alive, listening to the woman's words. The air grew even colder, the temperature dropping so suddenly that Ellen could see her breath fogging in the air. The oppressive silence that had once weighed on them now seemed to become more tangible, as if it was pressing down on them from every side. The woman took a step closer, her eyes fixed on Ellen, her lips curling into a slow, deliberate smile. "You will not survive," she whispered, her voice carrying a deep, haunting resonance that made Ellen's skin crawl. "None of you will." And then, without warning, the woman's figure dissolved into the shadows, vanishing as though she had never been there at all. The silence that followed was deafening, and Ellen could feel the pressure in the air thickening once again. She turned to Mark, her voice shaky. What is she? Who is she?" Mark didn't respond right away. His face was pale, his eyes searching the hallway as if looking for something. His lips were pressed into a tight line, his jaw clenched in determination. "I don't know," he said finally. "But I know one thing. She's not the only one here." Ellen's stomach turned. "What do you mean?" But before Mark could answer, the air seemed to shift again. The temperature dropped even further, and the house seemed to close in around them, its oppressive presence suffocating. Ellen's eyes widened as the sound of footsteps echoed through the hallway, slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. The darkness seemed to grow deeper, more solid, as if it were reaching out toward them. "Mom! Dad, what's happening?" Emily's voice trembled, barely a whisper. Ellen turned to her daughter, her heart aching as she saw the terror in her eyes. Ben clung to her side, his small body shaking with fear. "We're not alone," Mark said, his voice low and strained. Suddenly, a figure appeared at the end of the hallway, a tall, gaunt man in tattered clothes, his face hidden in shadow. His movements were stiff, unnatural, as though he was being controlled by some unseen force. The man stepped closer, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light, his gaze fixed on them. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as the man came into view. His face was gaunt, his skin stretched tight over the bones, and his eyes were hollow, dark pits that seemed to absorb the light. He didn't speak. He didn't need to. The malevolent energy that emanated from him was enough to freeze Ellen in place. "Who are you?" Mark asked, his voice barely a whisper. The man's lips curled into a twisted smile, and as he stepped forward, Ellen could hear the unmistakable sound of his bones creaking with every movement. "I am the one who watches," the man said, his voice low and gravelly, like the sound of rocks grinding together. "I am the one who keeps this place alive." The air grew colder still, and Ellen could see her breath fogging in front of her. She could feel the pressure building again, the suffocating weight of the house pressing down on them. "Who are you?" she demanded again, her voice trembling with both fear and defiance. The man stepped closer, his eyes glowing brighter now, the darkness around him seeming to thicken, to coalesce into something tangible, something dark and suffocating. "I am the keeper of the forgotten," the man whispered, "the one who watches over all who come, and all who stay." Ellen's stomach churned as the man's words sank in. She realized with a sickening certainty that they were not dealing with just one entity in this house. They were dealing with something ancient, something that had been here long before they ever arrived. "Please," Mark begged, his voice breaking. "Just let us go. We don't want to be part of this. We don't want anything to do with this house." The man's smile widened, but there was no kindness in it, only cold, empty malice. "You had no choice," he said, his voice echoing in the hallway, filling the space with an oppressive weight. "You are already part of it, and now you will never leave." The darkness around them deepened, swirling like a storm, and Ellen felt her chest tighten with an overwhelming sense of dread. The house was alive, and it was hungry. Ellen didn't know how much longer they could last. The shadows were closing in, the house growing more alive with each passing second. She had to find a way out before it was too late. The darkness thickened around them, and Ellen felt as though she were suffocating under its weight. Every breath she took was shallow, the cold air biting at her lungs. Her hands trembled as she held Emily and Ben close, their bodies pressed together for comfort in a place that offered none. The figure, the man who had appeared in the hallway, continued to stare at them with those hollow, unblinking eyes, his body unmoving, but somehow still suffused with a terrible, oppressive presence. His lips remained twisted into that same grotesque smile, his posture stiff and unnatural. "You are here to stay," he repeated, his voice a rasping whisper that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. "You have awoken the curse of this house, and now it claims you." Ellen's heart raced, her mind scrambling for an escape, but there was nothing. She could feel the walls of the house closing in on them, every inch of space around them suffocatingly tight. There was no way out. Not through the front door, not through the windows. Not even the shadows seemed to offer a path. "What do you want from us?" Mark shouted, stepping forward, his voice cracking with fear. "Why us? What have we done to deserve this?" The man did not respond immediately. Instead, he stepped closer, his movements slow and deliberate. As he approached, the temperature in the air dropped even further. Ellen could see her breath swirling in the thick fog of cold that surrounded them. The man's gaze never left them, his dark eyes unblinking, as though he were studying them, measuring them. "You've done nothing to deserve this," he finally said, his voice quieter now, almost pitying. "You are simply the next in a long line of victims." His words made Ellen's skin crawl. She didn't understand. How could this have been happening for so long? What was it about this house that could claim so many lives, so many souls? Suddenly, without warning, the walls of the house seemed to shift. The air around them grew heavier, as if the house itself were pulling them into its depths. The floor beneath them creaked ominously, and Ellen stumbled backward, almost losing her balance as the ground seemed to vibrate with a low, resonating hum. "They come for you," the man whispered, his voice now barely audible. "The house calls to them. It feeds on you. You are just the latest sacrifice." The cold was unbearable now, its icy grip seeping into Ellen's bones. She felt as though her very soul was being pulled from her body, her heart sinking in her chest. "What is this house?" Mark's voice broke through the suffocating silence, desperate and shaking. "What happened here?" For a moment, there was no response. The man simply watched them, his eyes unblinking, his smile still present but devoid of any warmth. Then he spoke again, his voice heavy with the weight of ages, his words like the creaking of ancient wood. "This house was built on blood, on lives lost and deals made with forces you cannot understand. It was never meant to be a home. It was meant to be a prison. A prison. The word echoed in Ellen's mind, reverberating through the hollow space of the house, resonating with some deep, primal part of her that understood what he meant. This house wasn't just a building. It was a living, breathing entity, its walls pulsating with the energy of something ancient and malicious. "What do you mean?" Ellen asked, her voice trembling with both fear and curiosity. "What happened here? Who built it?" The man's smile faded slightly, replaced with an expression that was almost sorrowful. But there was no pity in his eyes, only the emptiness of a soul long since lost. "The house was built by those who sought power. They bargained with the dark forces beneath this earth, exchanging blood for wealth, for knowledge, for immortality. But the price was steep. The spirits of those who perished here, those who were sacrificed to feed the hunger of the house, are still bound to these walls." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. This was no ordinary haunted house. It was a place of ancient evil, a place where dark rituals had taken place, where lives had been taken to fuel something far darker than she could imagine. "And now you are part of it," the man said, his voice almost gentle in its finality. "You cannot leave because you are bound to it, just as all who have come before you. There is no escape." Ellen's pulse raced. They were trapped. This wasn't just a haunting. This was something far worse. Something that had been happening for generations. The house had consumed everything, every soul, every life, and now it had its sights set on them. "Please," Mark whispered, his voice barely a breath. "There must be something we can do. We didn't know." "You should have never come," the man interrupted, his voice hardening. "There is no escape for you. You will remain here, trapped forever, feeding the hunger of the house, just like the others." Ellen shook her head, the reality of the situation sinking in. This wasn't a nightmare. This wasn't something they could just wake up from. They had entered a trap that had been set long ago, and now they were part of its dark history. Suddenly, there was a loud crash behind them. Ellen whipped around, her heart leaping into her throat. The hallway had shifted again, the floorboards splintering and groaning as something, or someone, emerged from the darkness. A figure, shrouded in shadow, appeared at the far end of the hallway. It was tall and gaunt, its face hidden by the shadows, but Ellen could feel its eyes boring into her. The temperature dropped again, so cold that it felt like a blade slicing through her skin. The man who had been watching them didn't seem surprised by the new arrival. In fact, he stepped aside, his form fading into the shadows as the new figure took center stage. This new figure was different from the man. There was something more sinister about it. Its movements were fluid and unnatural, its body contorting in ways that should have been impossible. Its presence seemed to warp the very air around it, and Ellen felt as though she were being pulled toward it by some invisible force. "Who are you?" Mark shouted, his voice filled with both fear and defiance. "What do you want from us?" The figure didn't respond with words. Instead, it reached out with a hand that seemed to extend too far, its long fingers curling like claws as they reached for Ellen. "No," she screamed, pulling Emily and Ben back, but the figure was already too close. The shadows around it grew thicker, swirling like smoke as it advanced toward them, its face still hidden, but the air around it thick with a sense of impending doom. Ellen could feel the cold radiating from it, the darkness choking the life out of the room, filling her lungs with ice. The figure stopped just short of them, its hand hovering in the air as if waiting. Waiting for what? Ellen didn't know, but she knew one thing. It wasn't waiting for anything good. And then, in a voice that seemed to come from all around them, the figure spoke. "Your time has come." The words hung in the air, thick and suffocating, as though the very walls of the house were closing in on them. Ellen's heart thudded painfully in her chest. and she could feel the icy grip of terror tightening around her throat. There was no room for escape. The house was alive, it was hungry, and now it had them. The figure stood motionless, its hands still extended, claws like sharp daggers poised to strike. It had no eyes that Ellen could see, but somehow she could feel its gaze penetrating her very soul. The darkness around it swirled, alive with an energy she could not comprehend. Mark's voice broke through the oppressive silence. "What do you want with us?" His words trembled, but there was a faint thread of defiance in his tone. "Why are we here?" The figure did not answer immediately, and for a moment there was nothing but the horrible, stretching silence. The shadows seemed to pulse with a dark energy, and the air grew colder with each passing second, until it felt as though they were standing at the edge of the world, on the brink of something unfathomable. Then, in a voice that resonated from deep within the recesses of the house, the figure spoke again, its voice low and gravelly, echoing as if coming from the very walls. "You do not understand," it rasped, its voice chilling in its finality. "This house is not merely a place. It is a prison. It was built to hold those who have bargained with the darkness, those who have been chosen to serve the house's will." Ellen's stomach twisted, a deep unease crawling under her skin. "Serve the house's will?" she repeated, her voice barely above a whisper. "What do you mean? What do you want from us?" The figure's outstretched hand curled into a fist, and in that instant, Ellen felt a jolt of cold rush through her body, as though the very marrow in her bones had frozen solid. She tried to move, but her legs felt heavy like lead. The shadows around them seemed to tighten, like a net closing in on its prey. "You were always meant to be here," the figure said, its voice becoming more forceful, more insistent. "The house has chosen you, the ones who awakened it, the ones who disturbed its slumber. Now you will become part of it. You will serve its hunger, just as those before you." Terror gripped Ellen's heart as she realized what it was saying. This house, this place of darkness, was not just haunted. It was a living entity, a place that thrived on the suffering of those who entered. And now she, Mark, Emily, and Ben had unwittingly stepped into its trap, bound to its cursed existence. She glanced at Mark, his face pale and strained, but there was a look of resolve in his eyes. He reached out, grabbing her hand tightly, as if to reassure her that they weren't completely lost yet. "We're not part of this," Mark said firmly, though his voice quivered with fear. "We didn't choose this. We won't serve you." The figure tilted its head, as if amused by his defiance. Its hand moved from the air, lowering slowly, and with each movement, the shadows in the hallway seemed to retreat just slightly, as though they were afraid of what would come next. "The house will choose for you," it intoned, its voice growing softer, colder. "There is no choice. Not anymore." Suddenly, the ground beneath their feet seemed to shake, as though the very foundation of the house were trembling. The walls groaned and creaked, as if the house itself were awakening, stretching after a long, dreadful slumber. The temperature plummeted even further, and the shadows around them seemed to writhe, as though they were alive, twisting and shifting in anticipation. Then the figure moved, its arms stretched unnaturally long, and it began to advance toward them, its body twisting with an eerie, fluid motion. The air grew thicker, and Ellen could hear a soft whispering, like voices in the walls, like the breath of the house itself. In a panicked blur, Ellen grabbed Emily and Ben, pulling them toward Mark as they stumbled backward, the oppressive weight of the house pressing in on them from all sides. They needed to move, they needed to find a way out before the house consumed them. But there was no escape. The door to the hallway that had once seemed like a possible way out was gone. The walls, which had once seemed like solid structures, now seemed to pulse and shift, as if they were part of some living organism. "Get away from us!" Mark shouted again, his voice thick with panic, but the figure kept advancing, its movements too fast, too unnatural. It didn't answer. It didn't need to. Ellen felt a cold sweat break out on her skin as the figure loomed closer, its form contorting in impossible ways, its presence suffocating. She could feel her heart pounding in her chest, the blood rushing in her ears, the walls closing in, the shadows tightening their grip around them. And then suddenly the shadows shifted. The figure stopped, as though something had held it back. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as the air seemed to shimmer. The temperature seemed to rise, just slightly, the oppressive cold easing for a moment. In the silence that followed, Ellen felt something else. A presence, a new energy different from the figures, but just as ancient, just as dark. From the shadows, another figure emerged. This one was different. Its form was cloaked in darkness, but where the previous figure had exuded an aura of suffocating terror, this one felt almost familiar. It moved with a grace that seemed to contrast with the oppressive atmosphere of the house, its movements purposeful, deliberate. Ellen's pulse quickened as she tried to make sense of what was happening. The new figure stepped forward, its presence commanding, but there was something about it that made her hesitate. It was not the same as the others. It was not made of the same cold, crushing darkness. It stopped in front of the group, its form now fully visible in the dim light of the hallway. The figure was tall, draped in flowing robes, but its face was hidden in the shadows of a deep hood. The air around it seemed to shimmer with an energy that was both cold and warm, both ancient and alive. For a moment, the two figures, the one who had been advancing and this new one, stood facing each other in eerie silence. Then the figure in the robe spoke, its voice quiet but filled with an otherworldly authority. "Enough!" The words echoed through the hallway, reverberating against the walls, shaking the house to its core. The figure who had been advancing halted in place, and the shadows seemed to recede just slightly. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as the oppressive weight of the house seemed to ease, if only for a moment. The figure in the robes turned toward them, its face still obscured in shadow. "Do not listen to them," the figure said, its voice soft but firm. "This house, it is not what you think it is. There are powers here that you cannot comprehend, but you do not have to be its prey." Ellen's heart pounded in her chest as she processed the words. Was this figure here to help them? Or was it simply another part of the house's dark design? "What do you mean?" Mark asked, his voice trembling, but his eyes filled with desperate hope. "How can we escape? What do we have to do?" The figure remained silent for a moment, and when it spoke again, it was as though the very air around them changed, growing heavier once more. "There is no escaping the house, but there are ways to fight it." Ellen's hope flickered, as fragile as a candle in a storm. The figure in the robe stepped forward, its movements deliberate, every step heavy with an ancient weight. The shadows seemed to shift around it, swirling like mist, as if they were hesitant to approach this new presence. There was a coldness in the air, but it wasn't the oppressive chill they had felt before. This cold was different, sharp, almost protective, as if the figure itself had brought an aura of resistance with it. Ellen's heart raced in her chest, her mind scrambling to make sense of everything that was happening. She glanced at Mark, who stood beside her, eyes wide with disbelief and fear, but also with a hint of hope. She couldn't tell if this new figure was their salvation, or just another part of the house's twisted game, but she couldn't afford to ignore the possibility. The figure in the robes raised one long, slender hand, the fingers slightly curled, as if beckoning them forward. "You have been brought here for a reason," it said softly, its voice calm and measured, carrying an eerie authority. "You are the latest in a long line, but you do not have to succumb. You can fight this. Fight it." Mark's voice was hoarse, barely above a whisper. How? This house, this thing, it's too powerful. The figure's head tilted slightly, as though it was considering the question. Power is not always what it seems. The house may have bound you, but it is not invincible. It is a place of ancient evil, yes, but it is also a place of weakness, of cracks that can be exploited. Ellen felt a strange spark of hope at the words. Could it really be true? Could they actually have a chance to escape? What do you mean? She asked, her voice trembling, but she forced herself to sound steady. How can we fight something like this? The figure's hand lowered, and it took a step closer to them, its robes rustling like a faint whisper in the night. You must learn the house's secrets. The more you understand its nature, the more power you will have over it. But time is running out. The house is waking. Soon it will be too late. A cold shiver ran down Ellen's spine as the words sank in. It was waking. The house was becoming more aware, more alive with each passing second. And if they didn't act quickly, they would be consumed, just like all those who had come before them. Who are you? Mark asked, his voice still shaking, though there was a desperate determination in it now. Why are you here? Are you part of the house? The figure remained silent for a moment, as though the question itself was one that needed to be considered carefully. When it finally spoke, its voice was filled with a sorrowful understanding, but there was an underlying strength in it, as if the very knowledge of the house's dark secrets gave it power. I was once like you, the figure said softly. I came here long ago, seeking answers, seeking power. I thought I could control it, use it for my own ends. But the house, it doesn't allow such things. It consumes those who seek to master it. Ellen's heart sank. What happened to you? She asked quietly, her voice filled with a mixture of dread and sympathy. What did the house do to you? The figure's head lowered slightly, and there was a long pause, as if the memories of the past were too painful to revisit. When it spoke again, its voice was softer, almost mournful. The house trapped me here, it said. It took everything from me. My life, my soul, my freedom. I became part of it, bound to its will. But I have learned its ways. I know its weaknesses. And I can help you, if you are willing to listen. Ellen felt a deep sense of unease wash over her as she processed its words. This figure, whoever or whatever it was, had been trapped in this house for what seemed like an eternity. It had been consumed by the same darkness that now threatened them. And yet, there was something in its words, something that felt real. The promise of hope, the chance to escape. But at what cost? She looked at Mark, who seemed to be grappling with the same thoughts, trying to decide if they should trust this figure, this strange and sorrowful presence that seemed to know more about the house than anyone could ever hope to understand. How can we stop it? Mark asked, his voice low but steady. What do we need to do? The figure turned its head slightly, as though it were looking past them, into the very depths of the house itself. There are rituals, it said quietly, ancient rituals that can sever the house's hold over you, but they are not without cost. The house will fight back. It will twist everything, turn everything against you. You must be prepared to face whatever it throws at you. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. Rituals? How could they possibly perform some ancient ritual to break the curse of a house that had been alive for centuries? What did they know of such things? And how do we learn these rituals? She asked, her voice thick with fear, but also with determination. Where do we start? The figure slowly raised its hand again, a slow, deliberate gesture that seemed to echo with ancient power. In the heart of the house, it said, its voice steady and commanding, there is a place, the forgotten room. Ellen's stomach dropped at the words. The forgotten room, the very room they had discovered earlier, the one sealed off for decades. the one that had drawn them in with its mysterious presence, the one that had hidden its dark secrets for so long. The forgotten room, the figure repeated, its voice resonating with a weight that seemed to shake the walls of the house. It holds the key to everything. You must go there. You must confront what lies within. Only then can you learn how to break the house's hold over you. But how? Mark asked, his voice desperate. We don't even know where it is. It's hidden. It's sealed off. The figure's face remained obscured in shadow, but Ellen could feel the weight of its gaze on them, a sense of quiet power that emanated from it like an ancient storm waiting to be unleashed. You will find it, the figure said. The house will try to keep you from it, but you will find it. The house will not let you go easily, but there is a way to survive. You must confront it, face the darkness within that room. Only then will you learn how to break the curse. A cold silence fell over them as the weight of the words sank in. Ellen didn't know what to feel. The figure had given them a sliver of hope, but there was no denying the danger they were in. The house was alive, and its hunger was vast. And now they had no choice but to move forward, deeper into its heart. Ellen's mind raced, her heart pounding in her chest. The forgotten room, the very place that had drawn them to this cursed mansion in the first place. The thought of returning there filled her with dread, but what choice did they have? The house was closing in on them, and the figure in the robes had made it clear. There was no other way. They had to confront whatever darkness lay hidden in that room if they had any hope of surviving. Mark's hand tightened around hers, his grip firm, but she could feel the tremor in his fingers. He was just as terrified as she was, but he wasn't backing down. His eyes locked onto the figure, searching for some sign of reassurance, some hint that this path wasn't as hopeless as it seemed. Where is it? Mark asked, his voice low, urgent. Where do we go to find this room? The figure in the robes didn't answer immediately. Instead, it took a slow step back, the shadows swirling around it like a living thing. The air grew thick with tension, and for a moment, Ellen could almost feel the house itself holding its breath, waiting. Finally, the figure spoke, its voice calm but filled with an eerie weight. You will know it when you see it, it said. The room is hidden, sealed off, but it can be unlocked. The house will try to keep you from it, but it cannot hide the truth forever. You must find the key. Ellen's mind spun, trying to piece together what the figure was saying. The house couldn't hide the truth forever. What did that mean? What key was it talking about? There was so much they didn't understand, so much they hadn't yet discovered about this house, about the evil that lurked within it. The key, Ellen murmured, more to herself than anyone else. Where do we find the key? The figure raised its hand again, its fingers spread wide as if summoning something from the depths of the darkness. The key is not a physical object, it said, its voice soft but filled with a hidden power. It is a memory, a fragment of the past. The house holds the memories of all who have entered it, all who have been consumed by it. To unlock the forgotten room, you must remember. You must awaken the memory that binds you to this place. Ellen felt a chill sweep through her body as the figure's words sunk in. A memory. She had no idea what it meant, but the thought of unlocking a forgotten memory terrified her. What kind of memory could be so important? What could tie them to this cursed house? Mark's brow furrowed in confusion. A memory? What does that mean? We've never been here before. The figure's head tilted, its face still hidden beneath the shadow of its hood. Not this house, it replied softly, but you have been here before, in another life, in another time. The house remembers you. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. Another life? What was it saying? Could it be possible? Could they have lived here before, long before they ever set foot in the mansion? The thought was dizzying, terrifying, and it made her feel as though her very sense of reality was beginning to unravel. "We've never been here before," Mark insisted, his voice rising with frustration. "What are you talking about? This is our first time here." The figure's shadowed gaze shifted toward Mark, and for the first time, Ellen felt the air shift, as though the very temperature around them had dropped another degree. The figure's response was soft, but laden with the weight of centuries of suffering. "You have," it said simply, "in a way that you do not remember. The house remembers you. It never forgets." Ellen's head spun, and she felt a nauseating sense of vertigo, as if the walls of the house were closing in on her from all directions. She stumbled slightly, her vision blurring as her thoughts became a jumble. This couldn't be true. It couldn't be. They had never been here before. She was sure of it, but the figure's words, those haunting words, kept echoing in her mind. "The house remembers you. It never forgets." "Why don't we remember?" she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Why can't we remember?" The figure did not answer immediately. It seemed to pause, considering the question, before its voice returned, softer than before, almost mournful. "The house erases what it must. It takes what it wants and leaves only fragments behind. But you will remember. The memories will return when you enter the forgotten room." Ellen swallowed hard, the weight of its words sinking in. She didn't know if she was ready for what lay ahead, but she knew one thing for certain. If they didn't face the truth, if they didn't confront whatever darkness lurked in that room, they would never leave this house alive. Mark squeezed her hand, his voice firm with resolve. "We have no choice. We'll find this memory. We'll remember, and we'll get out of here. Together." Ellen nodded, though a small part of her questioned whether they would ever leave. She had no idea what they were about to face, what horrors awaited them in the forgotten room, but she had to believe they could make it. For Mark, for Emily and Ben, for all of them. "Thank you," Ellen said quietly to the figure in the robes. "We'll find the room. We'll remember." The figure nodded once, its movements slow and deliberate. "Be careful. The house will not make this easy, but you are stronger than it knows. Do not forget that." With that, the figure stepped back, dissolving into the shadows as if it had never been there. The air seemed to grow heavier again, and the oppressive cold returned, washing over them in waves. Ellen shuddered, but she refused to let fear control her. Not now. Not when they were so close. Mark turned to her, his expression determined but pale. "We need to go. We can't waste any more time." Ellen nodded, taking one last look around the dim hallway, as if trying to find any sign of the figure's presence, but it was gone. Only the shadows remained, lurking in the corners of the room, watching them. Together, they turned and made their way down the hall, the sound of their footsteps echoing in the silence. They were moving deeper into the heart of the house now, where the dark memories waited to be uncovered, where the forgotten room was hidden. And whatever lay inside, they would face it. They had no choice. The mansion seemed to shift as they moved deeper into its heart, each step echoing through the long, dimly lit hallways. The air grew heavier with every turn they made, thick with the scent of old wood and dust. But there was something more, something faintly oppressive in the atmosphere, as if the very walls were alive, watching them. The house was aware of them, its presence undeniable, its intent unsettling. Ellen could feel the weight of her own breath, the sound of her heartbeat pulsing in her ears, a constant reminder of the fear that gnawed at her insides. She tried to steady herself, but the house seemed determined to unsettle her at every turn. The hallways stretched out before them, twisting and curling as though they were designed to confuse and mislead. Every door they passed seemed to hold a secret, every shadow a hidden danger. "This place, it's alive," Mark muttered under his breath, his voice tight. "I can feel it. Like it's watching us. Ellen glanced at him, her face pale but resolute. It is. And the longer we stay here, the harder it will be to escape. She was right, of course. The longer they lingered, the more they risked being swallowed by the darkness of the house. They couldn't afford to waste time. The forgotten room, the memory that awaited them inside, was the key to everything. If they didn't find it soon, they might never escape. They reached a staircase at the end of the hall, a wide, grand thing that spiraled upwards into the shadows. The staircase creaked ominously beneath their feet, as though the house itself was groaning in protest. Ellen hesitated, her hand gripping the railing for support. She felt as though the walls were closing in on her, the oppressive silence pressing down on her chest, but she steeled herself. There was no turning back now. "We need to go up," Ellen said, her voice steady despite the storm of fear raging within her. "The room is up there. I can feel it." Mark didn't respond immediately, but she saw the flicker of doubt in his eyes. He was afraid. They both were. But there was no choice. The memory, the key, the room, it was all waiting for them. And the house was not going to make it easy. They ascended the stairs in silence, each step taking them closer to the unknown. As they reached the top, the hallway stretched before them, dark and seemingly endless. The air felt thick, as if time itself had slowed down. The house was alive with a malevolent presence, and it was pushing them forward, herding them toward whatever awaited them. At the far end of the hallway, a single door stood, its frame worn and aged by time. It was the only door in sight, and Ellen's heart skipped a beat as she recognized it. This was it, the forgotten room, the place they had to find. Mark stopped beside her, his eyes fixed on the door. "Is this it?" he asked, his voice hoarse. Ellen nodded, her throat dry. "This is it." The door was old, the wood darkened with age and neglect. There was something almost ancient about it, a sense that it had been untouched for decades, locked away from the world. She could almost feel the pull of the room behind it, the weight of its secrets pressing against the door, begging to be released. But as Ellen reached for the handle, something stopped her. A sharp, unexplainable chill ran through her, and she instinctively pulled her hand back. The air around the door seemed to shimmer, to ripple, as though reality itself was warping. She looked at Mark, who was staring at the door, his expression tense, his hand hovering near his own weapon. "What's wrong?" he asked, his voice low, filled with concern. Ellen's lips parted, but she couldn't find the words to explain what she felt. The door was wrong in a way she couldn't articulate. It was as though the house itself was trying to keep them out, as though the door was a barrier between them and the truth. I don't know," she said finally, her voice shaky. "But something's wrong. We need to be careful." Mark stepped closer to her, his hand brushing hers for reassurance. "We've come this far. We can't back down now." Ellen nodded, though her fear threatened to overwhelm her. There was no turning back. They had to face whatever lay behind this door, no matter the cost. With a deep breath, she reached for the handle again, her fingers trembling as they wrapped around the cold brass knob. The air around her seemed to thicken as she turned it, the creaking of the door breaking the silence like the sound of bones snapping. The room beyond was pitch black, but as they stepped inside, a faint, unsettling glow began to reveal itself. Ellen's eyes darted around, trying to make sense of the space. The room was unlike any they had seen in the mansion. The walls were covered in dark, peeling wallpaper, the edges frayed and torn as if something had been clawing at them. There was a heavy, oppressive feeling in the air, and the air smelled faintly of something decayed, rotting wood, old earth. And beneath it all, there was the faint, metallic tang of blood. A single object stood at the far end of the room, a large, ornate mirror framed in dark, intricate wood. It seemed out of place, its surface reflecting nothing, a void that swallowed light instead of returning it. Ellen couldn't tear her eyes away from it, her pulse quickening as she felt an undeniable pull toward it. "What is this?" Mark whispered, his voice strained. He too seemed drawn to the mirror, his gaze locked onto it like a moth to a flame. "I don't know," Ellen whispered back, though a sense of dread gnawed at her. "But I think it's the key." She took a step forward, her breath shallow, the air growing colder with each movement. The mirror seemed to pulsate with an unnatural energy, a strange force radiating from it that tugged at her very core. She felt as though she were being drawn into it, pulled towards some unseen force. Mark followed her, but his expression was a mixture of fear and fascination. "This is it," he murmured. "This is what we've been looking for." But as Ellen reached out toward the mirror, something changed. The air in the room grew heavier, thicker, as if the walls themselves were closing in. The temperature dropped drastically, and the shadows seemed to deepen, stretching across the floor like dark, grasping fingers. A voice, low and guttural, whispered from the darkness, the words barely audible, but heavy with malice. "You should not have come." Ellen froze, her hand hovering just above the surface of the mirror, her entire body tensing in response to the voice. She could feel it in her bones, a warning, a threat. Something was wrong. The house was not going to let them leave without a fight. The voice, cold and raspy, seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere all at once. It echoed through the room like a distant memory, one that had been buried for too long and was now clawing its way to the surface. The hairs on the back of Ellen's neck stood on end, her body freezing in place as her heart pounded in her chest. She knew instinctively that whatever was speaking to them, whatever was in this room, was not human. Mark's hand shot out, grabbing her wrist, pulling her away from the mirror. "Don't touch it," he warned, his voice strained. His grip was tight, but Ellen barely registered it. The room seemed to be closing in on them, the walls shrinking with every passing second, and she could feel the weight of the air, thick and suffocating, pressing against her lungs. The mirror, its dark surface, seemed to mock them, reflecting nothing but emptiness. The words continued to hang in the air, resonating like a curse that had been cast long ago, lingering and waiting. "You should not have come," the voice repeated, its tone growing darker, more menacing. "The house does not forgive." Ellen turned toward Mark, panic rising in her chest. What is that? What's happening?" Mark's face was pale, his jaw clenched as he scanned the room. "I don't know, but we have to get out of here. Now." But the door behind them, the door they had entered through, was gone. It had vanished, as if the house itself had swallowed it whole. The walls, once lined with peeling wallpaper, now seemed to close in on them, the darkness growing deeper, thicker. The only light in the room came from the faint, eerie glow of the mirror. Ellen's breath quickened, the fear rising in her throat like bile. She wanted to scream, to run, but there was no way out. The room was changing, morphing, and with every passing second, the shadows grew more tangible, more alive. The air was thick with the scent of decay and rot. She could almost taste it in the back of her throat. "Ellen!" Mark's voice broke through the fog of panic in her mind. He was pulling her back, trying to drag her away from the mirror, but she couldn't move. Her body felt frozen in place, as if the house had taken control of her limbs. "Listen to me," Mark shouted, his grip tightening on her arm. "We can't stay here. We have to find a way out. Do you hear me?" But Ellen could barely process his words. She couldn't look away from the mirror. There was something in it, something that was calling to her. Her mind felt foggy, distant, as if the house itself was reaching inside her, twisting her thoughts. In the mirror's dark surface, shapes began to form. At first, it was just a blur like the outline of a shadow, but then, slowly, almost imperceptibly, the shape solidified. A figure, a man, appeared within the mirror. He was tall, dressed in dark clothes, his face obscured by shadows. His eyes, if you could call them eyes, were black as pitch, hollow, voids that seemed to stare straight into her soul. The man in the mirror moved, and with each step he took, Ellen felt a part of herself being pulled closer to him. She wanted to scream, to run, but the force was too strong. Her body refused to obey. Mark's voice was a distant echo in her mind. "Ellen, don't look at it. Don't listen." But it was too late. The man in the mirror took another step forward, and the shadows around him seemed to pulse, as though alive, as though they had a life of their own. His lips parted, and he spoke, though his voice was not heard with her ears, but inside her head. "You cannot escape," he whispered, his voice like gravel scraping against stone. "The house is yours now. You belong to it." The room seemed to spin, and Ellen's knees buckled beneath her. She fell to the floor, her vision blurring as her mind struggled to make sense of what was happening. Mark's voice became more frantic, more desperate, but she couldn't focus on him. The darkness of the room was swallowing her whole, and the mirror was pulling her in, its cold surface now radiating a terrible warmth. The man's figure grew clearer, his face now fully visible. It was a twisted version of a human face, skin stretched too tight, eyes like empty sockets, mouth twisted into a cruel smile. He reached out toward her, his hands moving unnaturally, stretching and bending in ways they shouldn't. His fingers were long, thin, like tendrils, reaching out of the mirror, creeping toward her. Ellen tried to scream, but her voice was lost in the crushing weight of the room. Her breath came in ragged gasps, her chest tightening as the figure in the mirror advanced. She couldn't break free. She couldn't move. She was frozen in place, trapped by the pull of the mirror, drawn toward the darkness that consumed it. "Mark," she gasped, barely able to form the words. "Help me." Mark was at her side in an instant, pulling her away from the mirror with all his strength. He gripped her by the shoulders, shaking her, his voice desperate. "Ellen, snap out of it. We have to get out of here." But the figure in the mirror wasn't done yet. It reached out, its fingers brushing the edge of the mirror, and suddenly, the room exploded in a deafening roar. The air itself seemed to shatter, the sound of crackling wood, howling wind, and distant screams filling the space. The mirror rippled, distorting like water, and the figure in the glass smiled, its eyes glinting with malice. "No one leaves," it whispered, and the room seemed to tremble with the force of its words. Ellen's world tilted sideways, and she was pulled into the depths of the mirror. The air vanished from her lungs, and she was falling into the blackness as the room, everything disappeared. The cold darkness of the mirror enveloped Ellen, swallowing her whole as she was pulled deeper into its depths. It felt like an eternity, endless, suffocating, a vast nothingness that tugged at every fiber of her being. There was no air, no light, no sound, just the oppressive weight of the void pressing against her chest. She wanted to scream, but no sound came. She couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. Then, as suddenly as it had begun, the sensation of falling stopped. Ellen's feet landed on something solid, rough, uneven stone beneath her. She gasped, the breath rushing back into her lungs, sharp and painful. She stumbled, her legs weak, her body trembling as she tried to make sense of where she was. Her surroundings were shrouded in darkness, but the oppressive feeling of the house, of something watching, lingered. She was no longer in the room with the mirror. In fact, she couldn't even remember how she had gotten here. The air was damp and cold, and the floor beneath her feet felt slick, as though it had been wet for years. As her eyes adjusted, she could make out shapes in the shadows, flickering forms that seemed to move, shifting and melting in the gloom. The walls around her were damp and covered in strange, dark stains. The air was thick with a musty, decaying smell. It was as though she had been transported into the bowels of the house, into some forgotten, hidden space that had not seen light or life in decades. "Mark?" Her voice came out broken, trembling. She looked around desperately, but there was no sign of him. The silence was unbearable, oppressive, stretching out in every direction. But then a sound distant but unmistakable. A faint, rhythmic tapping, like something dragging across the stone. Ellen turned toward the noise, her heart racing as she strained to see through the darkness. Her eyes searched frantically, but all she could make out were the shifting shadows that seemed to twist and contort with every movement. The tapping grew louder, more distinct, and as it did, the shadows seemed to take form. Figures, human-shaped but twisted, began to materialize from the darkness, their movements jerky and unnatural, as though they were caught in some kind of inhuman dance. Their faces were obscured by the dark hoods they wore, their features hidden beneath layers of rotting cloth and grime. Ellen stumbled back, her legs weak beneath her. She wanted to run, to escape, but the shadows closed in around her, and she was rooted to the spot. The tapping continued, now a rhythmic beat that echoed in the silence like a heartbeat, pounding louder with each passing moment. The figures moved toward her, their heads tilting as if they were studying her, curious yet hungry. The air seemed to thicken with dread, and Ellen's mind raced with panic. What were they? What did they want? As the first figure drew closer, Ellen could see that its hands were elongated, twisted, with fingers that stretched impossibly long. They reached toward her, fingers curling as if to grasp her. Her pulse quickened, but she was too terrified to move. Suddenly a voice, low and rasping, echoed through the space. It wasn't coming from the figures, but from somewhere deeper, from within the stone walls themselves. You have entered the house's heart, the place of its deepest memory. The voice was unmistakable. It was the same voice they had heard earlier, the one that had whispered to them in the mirror. It felt as if the very walls of this place were speaking, breathing, living. Ellen's head snapped around as she tried to locate the source of the voice. The figures were still advancing, but now she could feel something more. A pull, a beckoning force drawing her towards something in the distance. The darkness seemed to part for a brief moment, revealing a stone archway at the far end of the cavernous space. Beyond it was a faint, flickering light. The mirror was but a gateway. This is the place where all ends, where the house's history is woven into the very air you breathe. Ellen could feel the hairs on the back of her neck stand up as the words sank in. She had entered the heart of the house, the place where its darkest secrets had been buried, its memories locked away for years. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back. The figures continued their slow, deliberate approach, but Ellen's eyes were locked on the archway. Something was drawing her to it, calling her forward. The light beyond it was dim, but it held an undeniable promise, a glimpse into the truth, perhaps, or something even darker. Before she could decide, the tapping sound suddenly stopped, replaced by a low, guttural growl. It seemed to come from behind her, a horrible, animalistic sound that made her blood run cold. She whipped around, but what she saw froze her in place. From the darkness, a large, monstrous figure emerged, towering over the smaller, hooded shapes. Its body was twisted, misshapen, with skin that looked like decaying leather, stretched tight over its bones. Its eyes were black voids, just like the figure in the mirror, but its mouth was wide, full of jagged, yellow teeth that gleamed in the dim light. Ellen gasped, stumbling back as it stepped toward her. The air around it seemed to warp, distorting like a heat wave, and the ground beneath her feet trembled. "You should not have come." The voice, deep, dark, filled with malice, came from the creature's mouth, its lips curling into a twisted smile. You will remain here, as all who enter the house remain, trapped in its depths. Ellen could feel the room closing in around her, the figures drawing nearer, the creature's growl reverberating through her chest. It was a trap, an inescapable trap. There was nowhere to run, nowhere to hide. But then, in the distance, the archway seemed to grow brighter, its light flickering like a beacon in the darkness. The creature snarled, its black eyes narrowing, but Ellen knew what she had to do. With a surge of adrenaline, she pushed forward, forcing herself to move despite the weight of fear that tried to drag her back. The figures tried to reach for her, their long fingers brushing against her arms, but she pulled away, pushing through the thick air as the growl of the creature grew louder behind her. Her body was on fire with terror, but she kept her eyes fixed on the archway, on the faint promise of light. She had no choice but to move forward. One step, then another. The figures were closing in, their hands grasping at her. The creature's growl was deafening, and the walls around her seemed to press in with every movement. And then, just as she was almost there, just as she was about to step into the light, a hand grabbed her from behind, pulling her back into the darkness. Ellen gasped as the cold, bony hand seized her from behind, yanking her back into the suffocating darkness. She screamed, her voice caught in her throat, strangled by the pressure of the grasp that held her. The figure that had grabbed her was tall and skeletal, its fingers long and sharp like claws. It was one of the hooded figures, its face still hidden in the dark folds of its tattered cloak, but its touch was ice cold, leaching all warmth from her skin. She struggled, desperate to free herself from its grip, but the figure's strength was unnerving, unnatural. Her arms flailed, her legs kicked, but it was as if the shadows themselves were holding her. Her heart thundered in her chest as the figures began to gather around her, closing in like vultures, their empty eyes gleaming in the faint light. "No," she whispered, barely able to catch her breath. "Please." But her words were drowned out by the growl of the creature that loomed behind her, its presence an overwhelming force. It was drawing nearer, its heavy footfalls shaking the ground beneath her. Ellen's body went stiff with terror. She could feel the cold breath of the creature on her neck, its rancid, rotting odor filling her senses. She had to move. She had to escape. The figure's grip tightened, pulling her farther away from the archway, the light that had promised her safety. She could feel her body growing weaker, the energy draining from her as the figure's cold fingers dug deeper into her skin. It was as if the house itself was feeding on her fear, drawing strength from it, tightening its grip on her soul. Then, through the haze of terror, Ellen heard a familiar voice, a faint, desperate shout. It was Mark. She could barely make out the words, but his voice was unmistakable. "Ellen," he screamed. "Ellen, where are you?" She strained her neck, trying to see him, but the darkness was all-consuming, a wall that blocked everything from view. She couldn't see him, couldn't even tell where the sound was coming from. Her heart hammered in her chest, the fear clawing at her insides. She couldn't lose him. She couldn't be trapped here alone. The creatures around her began to close in, their eyes glowing with a malignant hunger. Their movements were jerky, unnatural, as if they were puppets controlled by an invisible hand. The grotesque creature that had spoken to her was just behind them, its form looming over her like a shadow, its deep growls reverberating in the air. The space felt like it was warping, shifting, as if the walls themselves were alive, closing in, pressing tighter. And then suddenly, a sharp, crashing sound broke through the air. It was loud, deafening, like thunder splitting the night. The ground trembled beneath her feet as the stone floor buckled and cracked. The figures around her shrieked in unison, their shrill voices echoing through the cavernous space. Ellen didn't know what was happening, but she didn't hesitate. She twisted in the figure's grip, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and with a burst of strength she didn't know she had left, she pushed herself away. The figure's hold faltered for just a moment, and that was all she needed. With everything she had, Ellen sprinted toward the distant archway. She could hear the creature's growl rising behind her, its footsteps thundering against the stone, but she didn't dare look back. The archway, the light, was all that mattered now. Her feet hit the uneven ground with urgency, every step a battle against the fear that threatened to freeze her in place. The air grew colder, thicker, as the creatures pursued her, their whispers and moans filling the space like a haunting symphony. She could feel the shadows reaching for her, grabbing at her legs, but she pushed forward, faster now, her body moving on pure adrenaline. Finally, with one last desperate leap, she reached the archway. As she passed beneath it, she was engulfed in a blinding light, the sudden warmth washing over her like a flood. For a moment, everything went silent. The growls, the whispers, the sounds of the creatures faded into nothingness. She was back. She didn't know where she was, but she wasn't in that place anymore. The darkness, the oppressive atmosphere of the house, had vanished. She was standing in a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a single flickering candle. The walls around her were plain, unadorned, but the air was different, cleaner, lighter, as if she had crossed into another world entirely. Her breath was shallow, her body trembling uncontrollably from the fear and exhaustion. She took in the surroundings, trying to make sense of where she was, but the hallway seemed unfamiliar, disorienting. The walls were made of old, weathered wood, and the floor creaked beneath her feet as she slowly moved forward, her footsteps echoing eerily in the stillness. "Mark," she called out, her voice hoarse, barely more than a whisper. There was no answer. The silence stretched on, thick and heavy, suffocating. Her pulse quickened again, and a wave of dread washed over her. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. Something was watching her. She took another step forward, her mind racing. Where was Mark? What had happened to him? Had he? Her thoughts were interrupted by the sound of movement behind her. A shuffling, scraping noise, followed by a low, guttural whisper. The air turned cold again, and Ellen's heart dropped into her stomach. She knew that sound. It was coming from the darkness, the place she had just escaped from. She spun around, but there was nothing there, just the endless stretch of the narrow hallway. But she wasn't alone. She could feel it. The scraping noise grew louder, closer, and before she could react, something dark and shadowy slid out from the walls themselves, something humanoid, but wrong. It was a creature, one of the figures from the darkness. Its shape was indistinct, shifting like smoke, but its eyes, those black, hollow eyes, stared directly at her. And it was smiling. Ellen froze, her breath caught in her throat as the shadowy figure advanced toward her, its movement slow and deliberate, like a predator closing in on its prey. It was a twisted version of a human form, its limbs unnaturally elongated, its face obscured by a dark, shifting veil. The only thing she could make out clearly were its eyes, those empty, void-like eyes that seemed to pull her in, drowning her in their endless depth. She wanted to scream, but no sound escaped her lips. Her legs felt like they were made of stone, too heavy to move. The figure's presence pressed against her, suffocating, as though the very air around her had thickened and turned to lead. It stepped closer, its form now clearly defined in the dim light. Its body was covered in tatters of old cloth that hung loosely, as if it had been left to decay for years. The smell of rot and decay filled the air, clinging to the figure like a shroud. Its skin, if it could be called that, was like old, cracked leather, and every movement caused a faint rustling, like dried leaves in the wind. Ellen's heart raced in her chest, her mind screaming at her to run, to get away. but she couldn't move. It was as though the figure had reached into her soul, freezing her in place, trapping her in its gaze. The creature's mouth, if it could even be called that, twisted into a grotesque smile. Its lips stretched unnaturally wide, revealing rows of jagged, yellowed teeth, each one sharp and uneven. The sight of it sent a fresh wave of terror through Ellen's veins. "You should not have come here." The voice was cold, hollow, a whisper that seemed to come from the very air itself. It was not the same voice as before, the one that had spoken to her through the mirror, but it carried the same ominous, predatory tone. Ellen opened her mouth to respond, but her voice failed her. She couldn't speak. The weight of the creature's presence was too much, pressing down on her like an invisible force. "You are trapped now." The figure's voice was even softer this time, its words carrying an air of finality, as though there was no way out. "This house, it owns you now. It will never let you leave." The temperature around her dropped even further, her breath coming in visible, shaky puffs. She could feel the cold creeping through her clothes, sinking into her skin, her bones. The figure's eyes never left hers, its gaze unblinking, unyielding. But then, just as the terror was about to consume her completely, she heard something, a noise, distant, faint, but unmistakable. A voice calling her name. "Ellen!" Her heart leapt in her chest. It was Mark's voice, weak, but there. She could hear it faintly through the oppressive silence, as if it were coming from far away, from deep within the house. She had to find him. She had to escape this thing. With every ounce of strength she had left, Ellen broke free from the creature's grip. She stumbled backward, her legs shaky, her mind clouded with fear, but the call of Mark's voice was enough to propel her forward. She had to get to him. She couldn't let him be lost in this nightmare too. The creature seemed to move, its form shifting and twisting, blocking her path. But Ellen didn't stop. She ran, her feet pounding against the old wood of the hallway, her breath ragged and uneven. The air around her seemed to press in, suffocating, as though the house itself was trying to drag her back. The shadows seemed to stretch and writhe, reaching out like hands trying to pull her into the darkness. But she kept moving, ignoring the growing whispers and the cloying pull of the house. She couldn't look back. You cannot outrun what lives here. The creature's voice echoed through the hall, a low, mocking laugh that made the hairs on the back of her neck stand on end. But Ellen didn't listen. She didn't care. All that mattered now was finding Mark. She reached a door at the end of the hallway, one she hadn't seen before, its frame twisted and warped by time, as though it had been forgotten for years. Her fingers fumbled for the handle, but it opened with ease, as if it had been waiting for her. The room beyond was small, cramped, and filled with an unsettling sense of familiarity. The walls were lined with old, dust-covered furniture, and the air was thick with the scent of mold and mildew. But what caught Ellen's attention was the figure standing in the middle of the room. It was Mark. He stood there, his back to her, his body motionless, as if he were frozen in place. His clothes were torn, his face pale and gaunt, but it was him. She could see his familiar, disheveled hair and his worn, exhausted expression. "Mark!" Ellen cried, her voice hoarse. She rushed toward him, her arms outstretched, but as she drew closer, she noticed something horrifying. Mark's body wasn't quite right. His back was hunched, his limbs unnaturally stiff. His movements were jerky, like a puppet being controlled by invisible strings. He turned his head slowly toward her, his eyes wide and unblinking, but they were wrong. They were empty, hollow, as though he was no longer truly there. "Ellen!" Mark's voice came out as a whisper, but it was not his voice. It was deep, distorted, like a hollow echo. Ellen stumbled back, her heart pounding in her chest. She wanted to run, to scream, but her legs wouldn't move. Mark's eyes locked onto hers, his gaze cold and unfeeling. "It's too late." The voice Mark's body, but not Mark, whispered. "You've already crossed the threshold. You're one of us now." Ellen's breath caught in her throat. She had come so close to escaping, but now it seemed that all hope was lost. The shadows in the room began to shift, swirling around her like a living thing, tightening, pressing in. The walls seemed to close in, the ceiling lowering, the air thickening. The dark shapes that had followed her began to materialize in the corners of the room, their faces twisted in grotesque masks of hunger. "No! No!" Ellen screamed, finally finding her voice. She spun around, searching for a way out, but the room was closing in around her. The door she had entered through had vanished. The walls were solid stone now, the cracks and crevices pulsing with a sickly light. And then from the shadows a whisper, a chilling, familiar voice that made her blood run cold. "Welcome home." The whisper seemed to echo throughout the room, the words curling around her like a noose. Ellen's heart pounded in her chest, each beat louder than the last, as her mind raced to comprehend what was happening. The walls seemed to shift before her eyes, distorting, rippling like water. She couldn't breathe, couldn't think, only feel the suffocating presence of the house closing in on her. Mark stood motionless, his eyes still locked on hers, but they were hollow now, devoid of the life she had once known. He didn't move, didn't speak again, but there was something in his gaze, a quiet, resigned acceptance, as though he had already succumbed to the darkness, to the very thing that had ensnared them both. Ellen took a step back, her mind screaming at her to run, but the room felt like it was shrinking, the air so thick and heavy that it pressed down on her chest. The shadows that lined the walls stretched out, reaching toward her with slow, deliberate movements. The figures were emerging from them, no longer hidden, but fully formed, their glowing eyes watching her, waiting for her to make the next move. "No," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I won't." But the shadows seemed to laugh, their laughter an unsettling combination of whispers and rasps that vibrated through her bones. The creatures that had stalked her from the darkness now surrounded her, their pale, ghastly faces grinning with grotesque joy. They moved like ghosts, their limbs stretching and bending at impossible angles, their forms shifting in the dim light. Ellen's back hit the wall, and she spun around, her mind searching for anything, a way out, a weapon, something. But the room had transformed completely. It was no longer a small, confined space. It had become a vast, cavernous expanse, with walls that seemed to stretch into infinity. The ceiling was far above her now, lost in shadow, and the floor beneath her feet seemed to undulate as if alive, like the beating heart of the house itself. The air grew colder, impossibly cold, and Ellen's breath turned to mist. She could feel the chill creeping up her spine, settling deep into her bones. Her skin began to prickle, her limbs shaking uncontrollingly, but it wasn't just fear that made her tremble. It was the oppressive weight of the house, the sense that it was watching her, controlling her, pulling her deeper into its grasp. One of the figures stepped forward, its form tall and gaunt, towering over her. Its eyes were like black holes, sucking in all light around them. It moved slowly, deliberately, as though savoring every moment. When it spoke, its voice was the same whispering rasp, cold and unfeeling. "You're not leaving, Ellen." The words slithered into her mind, like an infection taking root. "You're a part of this house now. You've always been." The floor beneath her feet groaned, the wood creaking as if in protest, and Ellen stumbled forward, her hands bracing against the ground for support. But something had changed. The floor wasn't solid anymore. It was like the earth itself was giving way, the space around her warping and shifting as if the very nature of reality was bending. The shadows in the corners of the room began to twist, contort, and as she watched in horror, they began to take shape, human shapes. Figures that had once been indistinct were now clear, their twisted forms standing tall and unmoving, watching her with cold, hungry eyes. "They're all here waiting," a voice whispered in her ear, low and guttural, like a serpent's hiss. "They've been waiting for you." Ellen's breath hitched as she backed away, but there was nowhere to go. The walls were closing in, and the figures moved in sync, shifting and contorting, taking steps toward her. Their bodies seemed to ripple with each movement, as though they were made of smoke, fluid, and darkness. She could hear their voices now, hundreds of voices, all murmuring in unison, speaking in a language she didn't understand but felt deep in her bones. The whispers were growing louder, overwhelming her senses. They spoke of despair, of death, of endless suffering, and of the house that had claimed them all, captive, twisted, lost to time. And they spoke of her, too, her name echoing in the air like a curse, like a beckoning. "Ellen, come to us." The voice was Mark's again, but this time it was hollow, distorted, like it had been dragged through the depths of darkness. "You belong to us now." Ellen closed her eyes, her chest tight with panic. She could hear the footsteps of the figures approaching, but she couldn't move. She couldn't breathe. The air was thick with dread, the weight of the house pressing against her with each passing second. She thought of her family, of her life before all of this, before the house. She thought of the quiet suburban streets, the life that had once seemed so perfect. How had it all gone so wrong? How had she ended up here, trapped in this nightmare? The walls around her creaked, and the figures began to close in, their hands outstretched, their mouths gaping wide, as if eager to consume her. But before they could reach her, something snapped. A loud, deafening crack shattered the air, and the floor beneath her feet gave way completely. She fell, plummeting into darkness. Ellen's body slammed into the cold stone floor with a sickening thud, the impact knocking the breath from her lungs. For a moment, everything was a blur, darkness swirling around her, a painful ringing in her ears, her vision flickering as she struggled to make sense of where she was. The air was thick with the musty, damp scent of decay, and she could feel the chill creeping into her skin, freezing her to the core. Her heart raced, her breath coming in ragged gasps as she pushed herself up from the floor. She was no longer in the room with Mark and the shadowy figures. This place was different, darker, colder, and eerily silent, save for the faint sound of her own heartbeat thudding in her ears. The ground beneath her was uneven, rough, like stone, and as she rose to her feet, her hands brushed against the cold, jagged walls. They felt alive, as if they were breathing with her, pulsing in time with her heartbeat. She tried to make sense of her surroundings, her eyes straining to adjust to the darkness, but it was impossible to see anything clearly. The shadows were too deep, the air too thick. She could hear the faint rustling of something nearby, but it was too far away to discern. Every step she took felt like it echoed, reverberating through the vast, empty space around her, adding to the overwhelming sense of isolation. "Where am I?" she whispered to herself, her voice trembling as the weight of her situation began to sink in. She felt like she had been swallowed whole by the house, lost in a labyrinth of forgotten rooms and corridors, each more terrifying than the last. The sudden noise of something scraping against the stone floor cut through the silence, and Ellen froze. Her blood ran cold as her eyes darted to the source of the sound. From the dark corner of the room, something emerged, something long, thin, and twisted, moving with an unnatural fluidity. A long, spindly arm reached out from the shadows, its fingers clawing at the air, and then a shape stepped into the dim light. It was a figure, hunched and skeletal, its body covered in dark, tattered rags. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Ellen could feel its gaze on her, cold and unblinking, like the eyes of something ancient. Its mouth opened, emitting a low, gravelly whisper that sent a shiver down her spine. "You shouldn't have come." The voice was hollow, like a distant echo from the depths of the earth. "You can never leave." The figure's words hit Ellen like a physical blow, each one sinking deep into her chest, tightening around her heart. The dread that had been creeping up on her turned into something much more intense, something suffocating. The walls seemed to close in, the darkness pressing against her, pulling her deeper into the void. She staggered back, her mind racing. Her pulse pounded in her ears, and she had to force herself to take steady breaths to calm the rising panic. She couldn't let this thing, whatever it was, get to her. She had to keep moving, had to find a way out, a way to break free from this nightmare. But the figure was not alone. From the corners of the room, other shapes began to emerge, their movements slow and deliberate, each one more grotesque than the last. Their faces were twisted and contorted, masks of agony frozen in time, their eyes hollow and soulless. They seemed to be everywhere, lurking in the shadows, moving with a purpose, closing in on her with every passing second. Ellen's breath caught in her throat, her body paralyzed with fear as the figures stepped closer, their hollow eyes never leaving hers. They were silent, save for the soft, rasping noises they made as they shuffled toward her, their limbs bending in unnatural angles. "You're one of us now." The first figure's voice was a low rasp, like a whisper carried on the wind. "You've been claimed. The house has chosen you." Ellen's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and confusion. She had to get out of here. There had to be a way out, but she didn't know which way to go. Every direction seemed to lead her deeper into the dark, into the heart of the house, where the shadows and the figures waited for her, their eyes gleaming with hunger. The air felt thick, suffocating, as if the very atmosphere were alive, watching her every move, feeding off her fear. She could feel the weight of the house pressing down on her, the walls closing in, the ground shifting beneath her feet. With a sudden, violent motion, Ellen turned and bolted, her footsteps echoing in the vast, empty space as she ran blindly through the darkness. She had no idea where she was going, but the sound of the figures behind her, their slow, deliberate movements, was enough to keep her pushing forward, her breath coming in ragged gasps. As she ran, she stumbled across something sharp and jagged that cut into her skin as she fell to the ground. She cried out in pain, but there was no time to stop. She scrambled to her feet, her body trembling with exhaustion and fear, her mind still clouded by the oppressive weight of the house. She had to keep moving. The darkness seemed endless, and every step she took felt like it was dragging her further into the abyss. She could hear the figures behind her, getting closer, their raspy whispers rising to a fever pitch. But then, as if by some miracle, a faint light appeared ahead of her. It was small at first, just a flicker, but it grew brighter with each step she took. Hope surged in her chest, and she ran toward it with everything she had left. When she reached the light, she found herself standing at the entrance of another room, but this one was different. The walls were pristine, untouched by the decay that had claimed the rest of the house. The floor was clean, the air fresh, almost too perfect. And there, standing in the middle of the room, was a mirror. The reflection staring back at her was not her own. The reflection in the mirror wasn't hers. Ellen's heart skipped a beat as she took a hesitant step closer. The figure that stared back at her was distorted, a grotesque version of herself. Pale skin stretched too tight, eyes wide and empty, lips pulled back in a twisted smile that didn't belong to her. The figure in the mirror was smiling at her with a cruel, knowing expression, as though it had been waiting for her to arrive. A chill ran down her spine, her hands trembling as she reached out to touch the glass. But as her fingers neared the surface, the reflection of her hand didn't match the movement. The figure in the mirror, the twisted version of her, remained still, its smile never wavering. Suddenly the glass rippled, like water disturbed by a stone, and before Ellen could react, a hand shot out from the mirror. It was cold, lifeless, with long, claw-like fingers that seemed to stretch toward her, the skin translucent, revealing the black veins that pulsed beneath it. She recoiled in horror, but before she could pull away, the hand grabbed her wrist, its grip icy and unyielding. The force of it yanked her forward, dragging her toward the mirror. The air around her turned thick, almost suffocating, as if the walls themselves were closing in. She screamed, but her voice was drowned by the whispering voices in the room. Hundreds of them, all murmuring in a language she couldn't understand. The hand twisted her arm painfully, forcing her closer to the mirror. The reflection of her face twisted in agony as the smile on the twisted version of her deepened, becoming something more sinister, more mocking. Ellen could feel her heartbeat racing, the panic rising, and her breath coming in short, desperate gasps. "You can't escape." The reflection spoke in her voice, but it was warped, distorted, as though it was speaking through layers of glass and shadows. "This place owns you now." The room around her seemed to shift, the walls stretching and bending. The air grew colder, and the mirror in front of her expanded, growing larger and larger until it took up the entire wall, reflecting a twisted version of the room she was standing in. The light from the mirror flickered, casting long, dark shadows that danced and writhed along the walls. Ellen tried to tear herself away, but the grip on her wrist tightened, and she felt herself being pulled into the mirror, her body fighting against the invisible force that held her. The whispers grew louder, rising to a cacophony of voices, each one telling her to surrender, to let go. "You are one of us." The voice from the reflection crooned, its tone dark and seductive. "You always have been." Ellen's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and disbelief. She couldn't let it take her. She couldn't become a part of this nightmare, this twisted house that had already consumed so many before her. She clenched her teeth, fighting with every ounce of strength she had left, trying to pull herself free from the grip of the hand, from the suffocating pull of the mirror. But the more she struggled, the stronger the force became. The glass of the mirror seemed to ripple and warp, the reflection of her face distorting further, turning into a grotesque, nightmarish version of herself. The hand from the mirror gripped her wrist harder, and she felt her body being pulled forward, her chest pressing against the cold, glass-like surface. In a final, desperate attempt, Ellen pushed against the glass with all her might, her nails digging into the smooth surface. The world around her seemed to tilt and spin as the room blurred, the dark shapes in the corners of her vision closing in. She had to break free. She had to escape. Then, with a sudden, deafening crack, the glass shattered. The mirror exploded into thousands of pieces, sending shards of broken glass flying in all directions. Ellen screamed as the pieces rained down around her, cutting into her skin. She fell backward, her body slamming into the floor, and for a moment, everything was still. The cold air hung heavy in the room, and the shadows receded, leaving her gasping for breath on the cold, stone floor. The broken mirror lay in pieces around her, the reflection of her twisted face now gone, replaced by the jagged edges of the glass, scattered like 1,000 shards of a shattered nightmare. She could still hear the faint whispers, the distant murmurs of the figures lurking in the darkness, but they were fainter now, like echoes in the wind. Ellen pushed herself to her feet, her body trembling, her mind reeling from the terror of what had just happened. She looked around, her eyes scanning the room, but it was empty now. The figures had disappeared. The mirror was shattered. The oppressive atmosphere that had surrounded her seemed to lift, if only for a moment. But Ellen knew it wasn't over. The house had not released its grip on her. It was only waiting, biding its time, preparing for the next phase of the nightmare. She had to keep moving. She had to find a way out. Her eyes flicked to the far corner of the room, where another door stood, this one different from the others. It was old, worn, its wood dark and weathered, but it was the only way forward. She couldn't stay here. Not in this place, where the shadows seemed to have a life of their own, where the whispers never ceased, and where reality itself seemed to bend and twist. Ellen took a deep breath, steeling herself for whatever came next. She had no idea what lay beyond that door, but she knew one thing. She couldn't stay in this room any longer. With a final glance at the shattered mirror, Ellen turned toward the door. The echoes of the whispers seemed to grow louder, the shadows stirring in the corners of the room. But she didn't stop. She couldn't. The door was the only thing between her and whatever came next. And so, she reached for the handle. Ellen grasped the cold, weathered handle of the door, her fingers trembling as she turned it. The door creaked open with an eerie groan, as if it hadn't been opened in decades. A gust of frigid air rushed past her, carrying with it a scent of rot and decay. She hesitated for a moment, her pulse pounding in her ears, but the shadows in the room seemed to beckon her forward, urging her to step into whatever lay beyond. Taking a deep breath, she stepped through the door, her heart racing in her chest. As she crossed the threshold, the atmosphere around her shifted once again. The air felt even heavier than before, thick with an oppressive energy that seemed to press down on her from all sides. The room she had entered was vast, its walls lined with shelves that seemed to stretch into infinity, crammed with old books, dust-covered trinkets, and forgotten relics. But it wasn't just the room that unsettled her, it was the silence. A silence so deep and absolute that it seemed to swallow any sound, even the sound of her own breathing. The oppressive quiet was suffocating, and every step she took echoed through the room like a distant drumbeat. She moved cautiously, her eyes scanning the dimly lit space. The faint glow of what little light there was cast long, jagged shadows across the walls, making the room feel like a cavern, its depths stretching far beyond her sight. She could feel the weight of history in the air, the lingering presence of those who had once inhabited this place. Something was wrong here. As she walked deeper into the room, she noticed a large, ornate mirror standing against the far wall. Unlike the shattered one she had left behind, this one was whole, its surface smooth and reflective, its frame carved with intricate designs that seemed to twist and writhe as if they were alive. The mirror was unlike any she had ever seen, ancient and haunting, its edges glowing with a faint, unnatural light. Ellen's breath caught in her throat as she stared at it. There was something about it, something magnetic, pulling her in, demanding her attention. She tried to look away, to move past it, but her feet seemed rooted to the spot. The whispers, the ones that had haunted her since she first stepped into this cursed house, grew louder, more insistent, filling her mind with a cacophony of voices. "Come closer," the voices murmured, their tones seductive, coaxing. "It knows you. It sees you." Despite every instinct screaming at her to turn and run, Ellen found herself moving toward the mirror, drawn by some invisible force. She reached out a trembling hand, her fingers brushing against the glass. The coldness of it sent a jolt of shock through her body, but she didn't pull away. Instead, she pressed her palm flat against the smooth surface, and in that moment, the room seemed to shift around her. The walls blurred, fading into darkness, and the air became thick and oppressive once more. The floor beneath her feet seemed to dissolve, and Ellen felt herself falling, her body weightless and disoriented, as though the very ground had disappeared beneath her. Then, with a sudden jarring impact, she landed on solid ground. She gasped, her breath coming in short, frantic bursts as she struggled to regain her bearings. Her eyes darted around, trying to make sense of her surroundings, but the scene before her was unlike anything she had ever seen. It was a dark, cavernous space, its walls lined with stone and covered in a thick layer of grime. The air was damp, heavy with the smell of mildew and rot. Faint, flickering torches lined the walls, casting weak shadows that danced in the corners of the room. And in the center of the room, there stood a massive stone altar. Ellen's heart skipped a beat. She felt as though she had stepped into some ancient, forgotten place. An altar, a ritualistic site, a place where something dark and malevolent had once taken place. The stone surface was stained, its edges worn with the passage of time, and strange symbols were etched into its surface, their meaning lost to the ages. But it wasn't the altar itself that made Ellen's blood run cold. It was the figure standing before it. The figure was tall, draped in tattered black robes that hung limply from its skeletal frame. Its face was obscured by a hood, but Ellen could feel its gaze on her, cold and unyielding. The figure was unmoving, its presence filling the room with an overwhelming sense of dread. A voice echoed in her mind, harsh and commanding. "You are too late." Ellen froze, her body rigid with terror. The voice was not the whispering voices she had heard before. It was deep, malevolent, and full of ancient power. She could feel its weight pressing against her, dragging her deeper into the nightmare. "You are the final piece," the voice continued, its tone filled with cold satisfaction. "The ritual has begun. There is no escaping what comes next." Suddenly, the altar began to glow, the strange symbols carved into its surface coming to life with a sickly green light. The room seemed to tremble as the energy in the air grew thick, palpable, like the very fabric of reality was being torn apart. Ellen backed away, her heart racing in her chest, but the figure in the robes stepped forward, its movements slow and deliberate. It raised one skeletal hand, pointing directly at her. "You belong to this place." The voice rang out, echoing off the walls, and Ellen's body seized up, her breath catching in her throat. "You are the one who will complete it." Before she could react, the ground beneath her feet shifted once again, and the entire room seemed to twist. The altar pulsed with an otherworldly energy, the symbols blazing with unnatural light, and Ellen felt herself being drawn toward it, her body no longer under her control. She tried to scream, to break free, but her voice was swallowed by the air, and the shadows around her grew deeper, darker. The figure in the robes moved closer, its skeletal hands reaching for her. "You have no choice," the voice whispered, as cold as death. "You will join us, whether you wish it or not." Ellen struggled, her body rebelling against the invisible force that was pulling her toward the altar. Her limbs felt heavy, unresponsive, as though the air itself had turned to stone, locking her in place. She could feel the heat of the glowing symbols on the altar, the strange green light seeping into her skin, burning through her bones. Her heart thundered in her chest, each beat louder than the last, but the fear that had once threatened to overwhelm her now surged into something else, a primal, instinctive need to survive. "You are mine," the voice echoed in her head, a command rather than a statement, and Ellen's mind reeled from the sheer force of it. "You cannot resist." But even as the voice pressed in on her thoughts, she fought against it, her mind screaming for control. She could feel her fingers twitching, her feet desperately digging into the floor, trying to find some way to anchor herself, to keep from being dragged into whatever twisted fate this place had in store for her. The figure in the robes took another step toward her, its presence suffocating, its movements impossibly slow, as if savoring the moment. The air seemed to freeze around her, the shadows stretching and warping as though they were alive. She was surrounded on all sides by darkness, the walls closing in with every passing second, and yet she fought. With a sudden, sharp motion, Ellen jerked her arm free from the invisible grip that had been holding her. Her legs buckled beneath her, but she managed to stumble backward, away from the altar. The figure in the robes hissed, its voice like the scraping of nails on stone. "You cannot escape." The words vibrated through the room, reverberating in her bones. "You belong here, as they all do." She barely heard it. The cold, oppressive force that had been holding her began to dissipate, and she realized that she still had some control over her body. She could move again, run again. Her breath was ragged, her throat raw from fear, but she didn't hesitate. She had to get out. She had to keep moving. Ellen turned on her heel, her feet stumbling beneath her as she made her way toward the door she had entered through. It was still there, its handle gleaming in the dim light, beckoning her with the only promise of escape. But as she ran, the room seemed to stretch, growing impossibly vast. The walls, which had once seemed close, now felt like they were miles away, and the door, though still in her sight, appeared to recede with every step she took. The figure in the robes had not moved, but its presence loomed over her like a dark cloud, filling the space with an overwhelming sense of doom. The whispering voices in the shadows, once faint, now became a roar, a relentless tide of words that she couldn't understand, but that filled her mind with terror. The floor beneath her feet felt unstable, shifting, as though the ground itself were changing, transforming into something unrecognizable. Ellen's eyes flicked back toward the altar. The symbols that had once glowed with an eerie light were now pulsing, the glow becoming brighter, stronger, as though they were feeding on her fear, drawing power from her every movement. And then, as if summoned by her thoughts, the figure in the robe stepped forward, its long, skeletal fingers reaching out toward her. Its hand hovered in the air for a moment, and Ellen felt a chill ripple through her spine, freezing her in place. She couldn't move. Her limbs had turned to stone once again. "You cannot run from what you are." The voice echoed in her mind, cold and unyielding. "The ritual has already begun." Ellen's throat closed, her breath coming in shallow gasps as she tried to force herself to move, to break free. But the more she struggled, the tighter the invisible grip on her became. She could feel her energy draining, the very life force being siphoned from her, drawn into the altar, into the dark entity that had claimed this place. The figure raised its arms, and the symbols on the altar flared brightly, a blinding, sickly light flooding the room. Ellen felt the room shift once more, her surroundings distorting, bending out of shape as if reality itself were tearing apart. She could hear the sounds of whispers growing louder, swelling into a cacophony of voices. The walls closed in around her, the room shrinking, the shadows crawling closer. It was as though the very fabric of existence was warping, shifting, and she was the last thread holding it together. "You will be one with us." The figure spoke, its voice more resonant, more powerful now. "You will join the forgotten, and your soul will belong to this house." Ellen's mind raced, her thoughts a blur of terror and desperation. She couldn't let it happen. She couldn't allow herself to become another lost soul, another piece of this cursed place. But the power that held her was too strong, and the altar's pull grew stronger with every passing second. Her body felt numb, her heart pounding in her ears as the last vestiges of her will faded. But then, just as all hope seemed lost, a sudden, sharp pain exploded in her chest. She gasped, her vision going white as the pain seared through her. She collapsed to her knees, unable to stop the cry of agony that tore from her throat. It was as if the very life within her was being ripped out, her soul wrenched from her body by the unrelenting force of the altar. And then, in the midst of the pain, something shifted. A sharp, powerful crack echoed through the room, louder than anything she had heard before. The air around her seemed to vibrate, the very walls shaking. The altar flickered, its light dimming for a fraction of a second before it flared again, brighter and fiercer than before. Ellen didn't know what was happening, but she felt the shift in the air, the change in the power surrounding her. The voice that had filled her mind with its malevolent whispers faltered, as if it had been interrupted. And that's when she heard it, faint but unmistakable, a voice that was not her own. "Leave her alone." The words cut through the darkness like a blade, and for the briefest of moments, the oppressive weight that had pressed down on Ellen's chest lifted. The voice, faint yet firm, echoed through the room, filling the oppressive silence that had held her captive. It was a voice full of power, something ancient and resolute, cutting through the malevolent whispers that had consumed her mind. Ellen's body trembled, the pain in her chest subsiding, her heart pounding with renewed strength. She could feel the pull of the altar weakening, the energy in the room flickering as though something was interfering with its dark ritual. The figure in the robes, still looming before her, seemed to hesitate. Its skeletal hands lowered slightly, the ethereal light around it flickering as if it were uncertain. The whispers that had filled the room suddenly stopped, leaving a suffocating silence in their wake. Ellen's mind raced, and for the first time since entering this nightmare, she felt a flicker of hope, a tiny thread of possibility. Who said that?" The figure rasped, its voice deep and hollow, but now laced with uncertainty. It turned, its gaze sweeping across the room, as if searching for the source of the interruption. "No one dares to defy me." But Ellen was no longer frozen. The grip that had held her in place was gone, and her body responded as though it had been released from some invisible restraint. She pushed herself to her feet, her legs shaking but firm. The darkness around her had not fully receded, but the energy in the air had shifted. It was no longer just the malevolent force of the house that surrounded her. There was something else, something new, and it was a force she couldn't quite understand. With a sharp breath, Ellen took a step back, eyes darting around the room. The altar pulsed once more, its symbols glowing brightly, as though it were responding to the shifting energies in the air. The air around her crackled, and she could almost feel a battle of forces, dark and light, ancient and unknown, fighting for control over this cursed space. Then the voice returned, louder, clearer. "This ends now." It wasn't the same voice. It was something different, something warmer, like the gentle strength of the earth itself, but strong enough to make the figure in the robes recoil. The walls seemed to pulse with energy, the ground beneath her feet trembling with a newfound force. The shadows in the corners of the room, which had once seemed to have a life of their own, were now retreating, fading into nothingness. Ellen stood her ground, eyes fixed on the figure that was now growing weaker, its form flickering, as though it couldn't decide whether to manifest or vanish entirely. The robes it wore fluttered in the air, as though caught in a wind that had no source. The altar, too, began to shift, the symbols fading and reappearing erratically, as if it were fighting against something far more powerful than it. "Leave her alone." The voice rang out once more, echoing in the very bones of the house. This time the figure crumbled, its skeletal body falling to the floor with a resounding thud. The air grew cold again, but not in the suffocating way it had before. No, this coldness felt different, like the chill of a storm breaking, the kind of cold that signals the end of something dark and the beginning of something new. Ellen's heart raced, and her mind spun in confusion. The figure was gone now, its presence nothing but a fading memory in the room. The altar, too, had lost its former power. The green glow had dimmed entirely, the symbols on the stone slab now nothing more than faded lines. She took another step back, her mind struggling to grasp what had just occurred. who had spoken to drive the figure away. What had just happened? The house still felt wrong, its oppressive atmosphere still clinging to her skin, but the danger that had surrounded her moments ago seemed to have receded. Then, before she could take another breath, a figure stepped into her line of sight. It was a woman, tall, her silhouette glowing with an ethereal light, as though she were made of the very air around her. Her presence was calming, reassuring, and though her features were soft and gentle, there was a strength in her gaze, a strength that seemed to pierce through the veil of darkness that had gripped the house. "You're safe now." The woman's voice was warm, filled with an ancient comfort that seemed to reach deep into Ellen's soul. There was no fear in her voice, no hesitation, only quiet assurance. Ellen's breath caught in her throat. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice shaky, but the fear that had once gripped her chest now replaced by something else, something approaching relief. The woman smiled softly, her gaze never leaving Ellen's. "I am not of this place," she said, her voice like the gentle rustling of leaves in a breeze. "But I was once bound to it, like so many before you." Ellen felt a shiver crawl down her spine. "Well, what is this place? Why is it like this? Why did it try to take me?" The woman's smile faded, and for the first time, her expression turned somber, almost mournful. This house was never meant to be a home. It was built upon a curse that took root long ago. Those who have entered here, they were never meant to leave. But I was trapped here, too, bound by the same dark force. Ellen's mind reeled. "You were trapped?" The woman nodded. "Yes. I tried to fight it, just as you did. I tried to break free, but the darkness was too strong. It consumed everything, until I found a way to resist." Ellen felt her pulse quicken. "How did you resist?" The woman's gaze turned distant, her expression sorrowful. "I was the one who called to you," she said quietly. "I called to you through the mirror, through the whispers in the dark. I needed you to hear me. I needed you to resist the darkness, because you are the one who can break the curse. You are the one who can set this place free." Ellen's mind raced, her thoughts swirling. I don't understand. How can I break the curse? What am I supposed to do?" The woman took a step forward, her figure shimmering in the dim light. "You must face what remains," she said softly. "The darkness has a master, a force older than this house. You must destroy the source, the heart of it all, if you wish to free yourself, and everyone who came before you." Ellen nodded slowly, her heart thumping wildly in her chest. She could feel the weight of her mission settling over her, but it wasn't the same suffocating weight it had been before. Now it was a weight she could bear. Now it was a purpose. "Where do I go?" she asked, her voice steady, her fear now replaced by resolve. The woman pointed toward a far corner of the room, where a narrow passageway had appeared, hidden in the shadows. "Down there. That is where you must go. But beware," she cautioned. "The darkness will try to stop you. It will tempt you, frighten you, but you must not succumb. You must remain strong, and you must trust yourself." Ellen took a deep breath, her body steadying as she looked at the woman one last time. "Thank you," she whispered, her voice full of gratitude. The woman smiled one final time. "Go now. You have a long road ahead of you, but the path will lead you to freedom." And with that, Ellen turned toward the passage, her footsteps sure and unwavering, ready to face whatever lay ahead. Ellen stepped into the narrow passage, her heart pounding with a strange mixture of fear and determination. The air in the corridor was thick with the remnants of something ancient, something that had been lying dormant for far too long. She could feel the walls closing in around her, the faint chill of the space creeping up her spine as she moved forward. The passage was lit only by the faint glow of an unseen source, but it was enough for her to navigate through the twisting, winding path. Her footsteps echoed in the silence, and each sound seemed to stretch, magnifying the oppressive stillness that enveloped her. The further she went, the more oppressive the air became. It wasn't just the weight of the house that pressed down on her. It was something far older, something that had been waiting for her, watching her as she approached. As she continued deeper into the maze of tunnels, the walls began to change. They no longer appeared as simple stone and mortar, but now seemed to shift with each step, their surfaces warping, twisting as though the very structure of the house itself was alive. The air grew colder, and the sense of foreboding thickened, wrapping around her like a vice. And then she saw it. At the end of the corridor, barely visible in the dim light, was a door, ancient, worn, and covered in dark, curling symbols. The door seemed to pulse with an energy of its own, as if it were alive, a living heartbeat that thrummed in time with her own. Ellen felt a chill seep into her bones as she stepped closer, her breath quickening. There was no mistaking it. This was the heart of the darkness, the place the woman had warned her about. This was where the curse had originated. This was the source of all the pain and suffering, the reason this house was so full of shadows. She reached for the door handle, her hand trembling slightly, and pushed. The door groaned as it swung open, revealing a vast chamber beyond. The space was unlike anything she had seen before, a dark, hollow room, its walls covered in ancient symbols, all glowing faintly with a sickly green light. The floor was littered with dust and decay, remnants of rituals long past. In the center of the room stood a massive stone pedestal, upon which sat a dark, pulsating stone, black as midnight, veins of blood red running through its surface, as if something within it was alive, breathing. Ellen's stomach twisted as she approached the pedestal, the oppressive weight of the room pressing in on her from all sides. She could feel the stone's pull, its power reaching out to her, tempting her to come closer, to take it, to use it. But deep inside, she knew this was not the way. This was the source of the darkness that had infected the house, the cursed heart that had bound the souls of the lost. For a moment, she stood frozen, the overwhelming sense of dread nearly consuming her. The whispers were louder now, scraping at the edges of her mind, urging her to give in. They promised her power, promised her the end of her pain, the end of the suffering. All she had to do was take the stone. All she had to do was claim it as her own. But Ellen fought back. She closed her eyes, blocking out the whispers, and took a steadying breath. She couldn't let it control her. She couldn't let it win. Slowly, she raised her hand, feeling the cold stone of the pedestal under her fingertips. The symbols around her flickered in the dark, the green light casting eerie shadows against the walls, but she didn't waver. This was it. This was the moment she had been fighting for. She reached forward, her fingers brushing the dark stone, and in that instant, everything seemed to freeze. The room went silent. The whispers, once a constant chorus in her mind, disappeared. The air around her seemed to hold its breath, and for a fleeting second, Ellen wondered if she had made a terrible mistake. But then, the stone shifted beneath her hand, its pulse becoming erratic, almost frantic. The glow of the symbols flared, brighter and brighter, until the room was consumed by blinding light. She yanked her hand back, heart racing, and stumbled backward, her eyes wide with shock. From the shadows, the figure emerged. It was not the robed figure she had seen before. No, this was something far older, far darker. It was a shadowy form, humanoid but not quite, its limbs twisted, its body stretching unnaturally, as though it were composed of darkness itself. Its eyes, if they could be called eyes, were nothing but voids, endless, infinite, absorbing all light around them. The air itself seemed to distort as it moved, bending and twisting to its will. Ellen felt the ground beneath her feet begin to tremble, the walls of the chamber shifting violently, as though the very foundation of the house were coming undone. The figure's voice echoed through the room, hollow and resonant, a sound that vibrated in her very bones. "You should not have come here." The voice was both a command and a warning. It was not a voice that she could fight against. It was a force of nature, an ancient power that had once ruled this place and would do so again, unless she stopped it. Ellen stumbled backward, her breath coming in sharp, desperate gasps. The darkness loomed closer, its tendrils reaching out toward her, wrapping around her legs, pulling her closer to the figure. She could feel its coldness seep into her skin, draining her energy, her strength. She tried to move, to pull away, but it was no use. The shadow was too powerful. Then, the voice of the woman, the one who had guided her, rang out once more, echoing across the chamber. "You can do this. You have the strength." Ellen's vision blurred, her thoughts spinning as the figure loomed closer. But she could hear the woman's voice, clear and strong, like a beacon in the darkness. Her resolve hardened. She wasn't going to give in. She couldn't. With a force of will she didn't know she possessed, Ellen pushed against the darkness, her body glowing with an ethereal light of her own. The figure recoiled, its form flickering as the light of the stone flared once again. Ellen reached out, her hand grasping the stone once more, feeling the energy surge through her. "I am not afraid of you." The words felt strange on her tongue, but they were real. She meant them. The shadow shrieked, its form writhing in agony as Ellen's energy surged, pushing against it with the strength of everything she had left. The air around her crackled with power, the symbols on the walls flashing with a brilliant light. The shadow faltered, its form twisting and distorting, its shape breaking apart under the pressure. "This is over," Ellen whispered, more to herself than to the creature. And with one final, explosive burst of light, the shadow shattered, its screams echoing through the chamber as it dissolved into nothingness. The room fell silent. Ellen stood in the center of the room, her breath coming in ragged gasps, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the battle she had just fought. The light around her slowly dimmed, the oppressive energy that had filled the chamber now receding into nothingness. The stone pedestal, the cursed heart of the house, was now still, its once pulsing glow extinguished. The symbols on the walls had faded, their eerie glow dissipating into the shadows. For a long moment, the silence seemed to stretch on, a heavy stillness that pressed in on her from all sides. The ground beneath her feet felt solid once more, no longer trembling with the force of the dark entity that had once ruled this place. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to feel the weight of everything that had happened. The terror, the pain, the fear that had gripped her heart since she had first set foot in this mansion. But now, with the darkness gone, there was nothing left but the quiet hum of her own heartbeat. The woman's voice, gentle and warm, filled the air again. "You did it." Ellen opened her eyes, her vision adjusting to the soft light that filled the room. She felt a warmth in her chest, a sense of relief washing over her as she looked around. The room, once a place of decay and despair, now seemed less threatening. The walls no longer warped and shifted, no longer twisted in unnatural ways. The symbols that had once been so vibrant now appeared as mere remnants, fading into the stone like forgotten memories. "It's over," Ellen whispered to herself, the weight of her victory settling in. She had faced the darkness, faced the horrors that had haunted this place for so long, and she had won. But the woman's voice, calm, yet tinged with a deep sadness, spoke again, "Not yet." Ellen's pulse quickened as she turned, her gaze searching the room. "What do you mean?" Her voice was shaky, uncertain. Was there more to this? Had the battle truly ended, or was there another fight she had to face? The woman appeared before her once more, her ethereal form glowing softly in the dim light. Her expression was somber, her eyes reflecting a wisdom far older than Ellen could comprehend. You have broken the curse here, Ellen. The darkness has been vanquished. But there is one last thing that must be done. Ellen's brow furrowed in confusion. What do you mean? I thought I destroyed it. The woman's gaze softened, and she stepped closer, her presence comforting yet heavy with an unspoken burden. The curse did not just bind the house, Ellen. It bound the souls of those who were lost here, souls who were trapped just like you. The darkness may be gone, but they are still here, lingering. They need to be freed. Ellen's heart sank. The thought of more suffering, of more souls trapped in this place, sent a shudder through her. How do I free them? She asked, her voice barely above a whisper. The woman's expression grew distant, almost wistful. The souls of the lost are not as easily freed as the darkness. You must give them a chance to move on, to leave this place. But it is not enough to simply wish them free. They need your help. You must release them from the bonds that tie them to this house and guide them to the other side. Ellen swallowed hard, the weight of the task before her settling on her shoulders. She had come so far, faced so much, but this was something entirely different. The thought of guiding lost souls, helping them find peace. It was overwhelming, yet something deep within her knew it was the right thing to do. Where do I begin? She asked, her voice steadying. The woman's smile was faint, almost sad. The ritual must be completed, Ellen. The altar must be destroyed. You must ensure that the power that once bound these souls is erased forever. Ellen nodded, feeling the pull of destiny take hold of her. She had come here to break the curse. She had come here to end the horrors. And now, it seemed, there was one final act of courage she needed to perform. The woman's gaze lingered on her for a moment longer, then she nodded. Go. The way is open to you. The souls are waiting. You must not hesitate. Ellen turned toward the door, the weight of the task before her growing heavier with each step. The shadows in the room had receded, leaving only the remnants of their dark influence. The stone pedestal still stood, but the darkness it once contained was now gone. The house was not entirely free. She could still feel the weight of its past, the ghosts of those who had suffered here. But she was determined to finish what she had started. As she made her way back through the winding passage, her mind was focused on one thing: freeing the souls trapped within these walls. The mansion no longer felt like a prison, but a place of sorrow, a place that had held too many lost souls for too long. The path ahead was unclear, but Ellen was resolute. She would give them peace. She would free them. Her footsteps echoed through the narrow halls, a rhythmic sound that carried the weight of her resolve. She passed through the corridors, now far less oppressive than before. The house seemed to hold its breath, as if waiting for her to finish what she had started. And as she approached the room where the altar had once stood, Ellen could feel the energy shift once more. The air around her was thick with anticipation. The shadows, though diminished, still lingered at the edges of the room, watching her every move. Ellen knew that the final step was upon her. She had to act quickly. She approached the altar, the stone pedestal now empty, its power drained. But the symbols that had once glowed with dark energy were still visible, etched into the very fabric of the house. Ellen could feel them, the echoes of the curse still hanging in the air, faint but undeniable. With a steadying breath, she placed her hands on the altar, her fingers brushing the cold stone. The energy in the room pulsed, faint at first, then growing stronger as she focused her mind on the task before her. I free you. The words came out softly but with conviction. I release you from this place. The house seemed to tremble at her words, the symbols on the walls flickering in response. The shadows writhed, as though they were struggling to hold on to the remnants of their power, but Ellen's words were stronger. Her determination, her desire to see this through, pushed them back. "You are free." She spoke the words again, louder this time. "You are free to move on." The room was silent for a moment, the air still and heavy, and then, as if a great weight had been lifted, the shadows began to fade. Slowly, they disintegrated, the last vestiges of the curse vanishing into nothingness. The energy that had once filled the house with darkness was gone, leaving only the faintest trace behind. Ellen stood there for a long time, her body trembling from the exertion, but her heart filled with peace. She had done it. The house was no longer a prison. The souls were free. The woman's voice echoed in her mind once more, soft and full of pride. "You did it, Ellen. You have freed them." Ellen smiled faintly, her eyes closing as the weight of the journey lifted from her shoulders. She had faced the darkness. She had fought it. And now she had won. And for the first time since entering this house, Ellen felt a sense of peace settle over her. Ellen took a deep breath, feeling the weight of everything she had endured slowly lift from her shoulders. The house, though still old and worn, no longer carried the same oppressive energy. The ghosts, the lingering darkness, those forces that had once controlled every inch of this mansion, had finally been released. The air was clearer now, calmer. She knew she had done what she came to do. She had freed the souls, broken the curse, and put an end to the darkness that had held this place captive for so long. But even with this weight lifted from her heart, Ellen could not shake the feeling that something was still left undone. The woman's voice, calm and reassuring, continued to echo in her mind, filling her with a sense of peace. Still, she lingered in the empty room, hesitant to leave. She had faced the horrors of the house, witnessed its dark secrets, and fought against its very foundation. But now it was over. It was time to go. She turned toward the door and took her first step, her movements slow, deliberate. The passageway that had once seemed so claustrophobic now appeared less threatening, less confining. The air was lighter, as if the house itself had taken a breath of relief. She walked through the halls, past the rooms that had once been filled with shadows, their dark corners now illuminated with the faint glow of sunlight streaming in through the windows. Each step brought her closer to the exit, and with every passing moment, the house seemed to lose its hold on her. The sounds of the outside world began to seep through the walls, a faint breeze stirring the curtains. The house, now just a building, no longer had the power to reach inside her and twist her thoughts. It had lost its grip, its control. But even as she neared the door, the memory of the past, the echoes of the lives that had once inhabited these walls, lingered in her mind. She could feel them, those who had been trapped here for so long. They had finally been freed, but their presence would not be forgotten. She would carry their stories with her, the memories of those who had once lived in the shadows of this house, trapped by its curse. She reached the front door, her hand resting on the cold brass handle. The house, now silent, seemed to watch her, as if waiting for her final decision. Ellen took one last look at the mansion, at the faded, crumbling walls that had once been home to so much darkness. And with that, she stepped out into the light of the outside world, closing the door behind her. The wind brushed her face as she stepped onto the porch, and for the first time, she felt a sense of freedom she had never known before. The house behind her no longer held its secrets, no longer held its horrors. It was simply a building, a place where once dark forces had been, but now it was empty. As she walked away from the mansion, the woman's voice spoke one last time, fading as the distance between them grew. "You are free now, Ellen. You have done what no one else could." Ellen smiled, a soft, bittersweet smile. She had done it. She had faced the darkness and emerged victorious. She had freed the souls trapped in that house, ended the curse that had tormented it for generations. And now, for the first time in her life, she was truly free. The mansion behind her stood silent, its dark past now nothing but a memory, fading into the distance as she moved forward into a new life, one not defined by the shadows of the past. And that's the end of the story. Make sure to like and subscribe.